Picture this. You're sitting in a dark movie theater, completely absorbed in what's happening on screen. The hero faces an impossible choice. Your heart races, your palms sweat. You're experiencing genuine emotions for something that doesn't exist. But here's where it gets weird. What if I told you that your entire life might be nothing more than a movie playing in someone else's mind? Welcome to the most unsettling journey your consciousness will ever take. If you think you understand reality, you're about to discover that everything you've accepted as truth might be nothing more than an elaborate illusion. And once you see it, there's no going back. Don't try to understand everything at once. Just let it happen. Let these ideas seep into the spaces between your thoughts. Because what we're about to explore doesn't just challenge what you know, it challenges what it means to know anything at all. The human brain processes roughly 11 million bits of information per second, yet you're only consciously aware of about 40 of them. That means 99.99996% of your reality is happening without your permission, without your knowledge, without your control. You're not the director of your own movie. You're barely even a spectator. But let's start with something simpler, something that will make you question the very ground beneath your feet. Imagine you're walking down a familiar street, the same street you've walked 1,000 times, but today something's different. The blue house on the corner, and wasn't it green yesterday? The tree in front of the coffee shop, didn't it have different leaves? You shake your head, convincing yourself you're just tired, just stressed, just human. This is what philosophers call the problem of memory. How do you know your memories are real? How do you know the past actually happened the way you remember it? What if your memories are being constantly rewritten, updated, edited like a Wikipedia page in your sleep? Here's the kicker. Science suggests they are. Every time you remember something, you're not accessing a file in your brain like a computer. You're reconstructing the memory from scratch, and each reconstruction changes it. Your first kiss, your graduation day, the death of your grandmother. None of these memories are the same as when they first formed. They're copies of copies of copies, each one slightly different from the last. So who were you yesterday? Who will you be tomorrow? If your memories are fluid, if your past is constantly being rewritten, then what exactly is the you that exists in this moment? This isn't just philosophical speculation. This is the foundation of one of the most disturbing experiments in modern psychology. In the 1970s, researcher Elizabeth Loftus discovered that she could implant false memories in people's minds with shocking ease. She convinced participants that they had been lost in a shopping mall as children, that they had witnessed accidents that never happened, that they had experienced trauma that was completely fabricated. But here's what kept her awake at night. If false memories could be implanted so easily, how many of your real memories are actually false? How much of your identity is built on events that never happened? The implications are staggering. Your personality, your preferences, your fears, your dreams, all of these emerge from your memories. If your memories are unreliable, then what does that say about you? Are you real, or are you just a collection of false stories your brain tells itself? And this is just the beginning. Because if memory is unreliable, if the past is fluid, then what about the present? What about the very moment you're experiencing right now? You think you're reading these words, you think you're understanding these concepts. But what if you're not? What if this entire experience is just another false memory being created in real time? What if you're dreaming right now, and you'll wake up tomorrow with a vague recollection of reading something strange online? The ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi once dreamed he was a butterfly. When he woke up, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he was actually a butterfly dreaming he was a man. How would you know the difference? How would you know which reality is real? This is where we begin to understand the true nature of consciousness. It's not a spotlight illuminating reality, it's a storyteller, weaving narratives from incomplete information, filling in gaps with assumptions, creating coherence where none exists. Your brain is lying to you right now. It's filling in the blind spot in your vision so you don't notice the gap. It's smoothing out the jerky movements of your eyes so the world appears stable. It's creating a sense of continuity across the gaps in your attention. You're not experiencing reality. You're experiencing your brain's best guess at what reality might be. But if your brain is constantly lying to you, constantly creating false experiences, constantly rewriting your memories, then what is real? What can you trust? What can you know for certain? The answer might terrify you. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. You can't trust your memories because they're constantly being rewritten. You can't trust your perceptions because they're constantly being edited. You can't trust your thoughts because they emerge from unreliable sources. You can't even trust your sense of being you because that's built on all of these unreliable foundations. So what does this mean for how you live your life? If nothing is certain, if everything is potentially false, then how do you make decisions? How do you form relationships? How do you find meaning in a world that might not even exist? Welcome to the first paradox of consciousness. The more you understand about how your mind works, the less you can trust it. The more you learn about reality, the less real it becomes. But don't worry, this is just the surface. We're about to go much, much deeper. You wake up every morning with the unshakable conviction that you're the same person who went to sleep the night before. But what if that's the biggest lie your brain ever told you? Let's run an experiment. Think about yourself from 10 years ago. Same name, same body, same social security number. But are you really the same person? Your cells have been replaced. Your thoughts have changed. Your memories have been rewritten. Your personality has shifted. Even your DNA has been damaged and repaired countless times. So what makes you you? This isn't just an abstract philosophical question. It's a problem that haunts neuroscientists, keeps philosophers awake at night, and challenges everything we think we know about human identity. Because the deeper we dig into consciousness, the more we realize that the self might be nothing more than a persistent illusion. Here's where it gets really trippy. Imagine you have a ship. Let's call it the ship of Theseus. Over time, you replace every single plank, every nail, every rope. When you're done, is it still the same ship? What if you took all the original parts and built a second ship? Which one would be the real ship of Theseus? Your body is the ship of Theseus. Every 7 years, almost every cell in your body is replaced. The skin you're in right now, it wasn't there a month ago. The blood flowing through your veins, it's been recycled countless times. Even your brain cells, once thought to be permanent, are now known to regenerate throughout your life. But here's where it gets even weirder. What if the replacement happened all at once? What if you went to sleep tonight and woke up tomorrow in a completely different body, different DNA, different fingerprints, different everything, but with all your memories intact? Would you still be you? Most people would say yes. Identity, they'd argue, is about continuity of memory and personality, not physical continuity. But remember what we learned about memory in the last segment. If your memories are constantly being rewritten, if they're unreliable, if they can be false, then what kind of foundation is that for identity? Let's push this further. Imagine scientists could create a perfect copy of you, not just your body, but your entire brain, complete with all your memories, personality traits, and neural patterns. This copy would wake up tomorrow morning believing it was you. It would have all your memories, all your relationships, all your dreams and fears. From its perspective, it would be the real you. But here's the kicker. You'd still be alive too. Two identical yous, both with equal claim to being the real one. Which one would be right? Which one would be the original? And more importantly, which one would be you? This isn't science fiction. This is a real philosophical problem that becomes more relevant every day as we advance in brain science, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. Companies are already working on uploading consciousness to computers. Others are developing technologies that could potentially copy or transfer memories. The question of what makes you you isn't just academic, it's practical. And it gets worse. What if you found out that you were already a copy? What if the original you died years ago, and what you think of as your life is actually the existence of a perfect replica who inherited all your memories? How would you know? How would you feel? Would it matter? The Buddhist concept of Anatman suggests that the self is indeed an illusion, that there is no fixed, permanent identity, just a flowing stream of consciousness that creates the appearance of continuity. Modern neuroscience is starting to agree. Studies of patients with split brain conditions show that consciousness might not be unified at all, but rather a collection of separate processes that usually work together but can be separated. In fact, You might not be just one person. You might be a committee. Think about it. Have you ever had an internal argument with yourself? One part of you wants to eat the cake, another part knows you should stick to your diet. One part wants to stay in bed, another part knows you need to get up. One part falls in love, another part knows it's a bad idea. These aren't just conflicting thoughts. They might be different aspects of your consciousness that usually cooperate but sometimes disagree. Recent brain research suggests that consciousness might be more like a democracy than a dictatorship. Different parts of your brain vote on decisions, and the majority wins. But sometimes the vote is close. Sometimes there's a tie. Sometimes the winning faction changes its mind. So when you say, "I decided to do this," which "I" are you talking about? The part that made the decision, the part that's reporting on it, the part that's remembering it, or some other part entirely? This fragmentation of identity becomes even more pronounced when we consider the role of attention. You can only focus on one thing at a time, but your brain is processing millions of things simultaneously. The vast majority of your mental activity happens without your awareness. So who's in charge when you're not paying attention? Experiments have shown that people can be primed to make certain decisions without their conscious awareness. They'll choose certain words, prefer certain colors, even select certain products based on subliminal influences they never consciously noticed. If your decisions are being influenced by factors you're not aware of, then who's really making your choices? The answer is disturbing. It might not be you. At least, not the you think you are. This brings us to one of the most unsettling questions in all of psychology. Do you actually have free will, or is the sense of choosing just another illusion created by your brain? When you decided to keep reading this, did you really decide? Or did your brain decide and then create the experience of having chosen? Some researchers argue that free will is an illusion. They point to experiments showing that brain activity associated with a decision begins several hundred milliseconds before the person reports being aware of making the choice. In other words, your brain decides before you do. But if you don't have free will, then what are you? A passenger in your own body? A spectator watching your life unfold? A character in a story being written by your unconscious mind? The implications are staggering. If you don't choose your actions, then are you responsible for them? If your personality is just the result of neural processes you don't control, then who deserves credit for your achievements? Who deserves blame for your mistakes? And if you're not really in control, if your sense of self is just an illusion, if your identity is nothing more than a story your brain tells itself, then what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to die? These aren't just philosophical puzzles. They're practical questions that affect how you understand yourself, how you relate to others, and how you make sense of your place in the universe. Because once you start questioning the nature of identity, once you start seeing through the illusion of the self, you can't unsee it. The person you were when you started reading this might already be gone, replaced by a slightly different version who's been changed by these ideas. And tomorrow that person will be replaced by another, and another, and another. So who are you really? And more importantly, who will you be when you wake up tomorrow? Right now, as you read these words, you feel like you're in control. You're making conscious decisions, whether to keep reading, how to interpret these ideas, what to think about them. But what if I told you that this sense of control is the biggest con job in the history of evolution? You're not the CEO of your mind. You're not even middle management. You're more like a press secretary, creating explanations for decisions that have already been made by departments you don't even know exist. Let's dive into the most mind-bending discovery in modern neuroscience. You don't have one consciousness, you have many. Right now, different parts of your brain are voting on what to pay attention to, what to remember, how to feel, what to do next. And the you that feels like it's in charge, that's just the part that gets to announce the results. Welcome to the democracy of consciousness, where your sense of unified self is actually a carefully orchestrated illusion created by competing factions in your own mind. Here's how deep this rabbit hole goes. In the 1960s, researchers began studying patients who had undergone split brain surgery, a procedure that severed the connection between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. What they discovered shattered everything we thought we knew about consciousness. These patients effectively had two separate minds in one skull. The left hemisphere could speak, but couldn't see what the right hemisphere was seeing. The right hemisphere could see but couldn't speak. When researchers showed a picture to only the right hemisphere, the patient couldn't verbally describe what they saw, but they could draw it with their left hand. Even more bizarre, when the right hemisphere was given a command that only it could see, the patient would follow the command but couldn't explain why. They would stand up, walk around, or pick up objects, and when asked why they did it, they would confabulate, make up explanations that felt true to them but had nothing to do with the real reason. The left hemisphere, it turned out, was like a built-in spin doctor, constantly creating stories to explain actions it didn't control or understand. And here's the kicker: it believed its own stories. It wasn't lying, it genuinely thought it knew why the person was acting that way. But here's where it gets really unsettling. If this is happening in split-brain patients, what makes you think it's not happening in your perfectly normal brain right now? Research suggests that your brain is constantly making decisions below the level of consciousness, and your verbal, rational mind is just along for the ride, creating explanations after the fact. When you reach for a glass of water, the decision to reach begins in your brain several hundred milliseconds before you're consciously aware of being thirsty. When you choose between two options, brain scans can predict your choice up to 10 seconds before you report making the decision. So who's really in charge? The answer is nobody and everybody. Your brain is more like a bustling city than a single entity. Different neighborhoods specialize in different functions. The visual cortex processes what you see. The auditory cortex handles what you hear. The motor cortex controls movement. The prefrontal cortex manages planning and decision-making. And like any city, these neighborhoods sometimes cooperate and sometimes conflict. But unlike a city, there's no mayor. There's no central authority making executive decisions. Instead, there's a constant process of negotiation, competition, and coalition building between different neural networks. The decision that emerges isn't made by any single part of your brain. It's the result of a complex democratic process that you're not even aware of. This is why you can feel conflicted about decisions. Part of you wants to quit your job, but another part wants security. Part of you wants to eat healthy, but another part craves sugar. Part of you wants to be social, but another part wants to be alone. These aren't just different thoughts. They're different constituencies in the democracy of your mind, lobbying for different outcomes. And just like in any democracy, the loudest voice doesn't always win. Sometimes a coalition of smaller voices can overpower a single strong one. Sometimes the outcome depends on which voices happen to be active at the moment the decision is made. Sometimes the result surprises everyone, including you. This explains why you can sometimes make decisions that feel like they came from nowhere, why you can change your mind about fundamental beliefs, why you can act in ways that contradict your values, why you can wake up one day and feel like a completely different person. It's because you are. The coalition that's in charge of your consciousness today might be completely different from the one that was in charge yesterday. The you that's reading this right now might be a temporary alliance of neural networks that has never existed before and will never exist again. But it gets even weirder. Research suggests that consciousness might not even be necessary for most of what you do. Studies show that people can navigate complex environments, make sophisticated decisions, and even engage in conversations while under anesthesia or in vegetative states. The unconscious mind is incredibly capable, in many ways more capable than the conscious mind. So what is consciousness for? Why did evolution bother creating this sense of unified self if it's not actually in control? Some researchers think consciousness is like a public relations department for the brain. Its job isn't to make decisions, it's to create a coherent narrative about the decisions that have already been made. It takes the chaotic parallel processing of the unconscious mind and turns it into a simple, linear story that makes sense to other people. When someone asks you why you chose chocolate over vanilla, consciousness gives them an answer. I prefer chocolate. But the real reason might be incredibly complex, a combination of genetic predispositions, childhood memories, current blood sugar levels, recent experiences, subliminal priming, and dozens of other factors that your conscious mind never considered. The story consciousness tells is useful for social interaction, but it's not accurate. It's a simplified, sanitized version of the truth designed to make you seem rational and consistent to yourself and others. But underneath that story, the real you is a seething mass of competing desires, unconscious biases, and automatic responses. This has profound implications for how you understand yourself and your place in the world. If consciousness is just a storytelling device, then the story of your life, your memories, your achievements, your relationships, your dreams, might be largely fictional, not intentionally false, but simplified and edited to create coherence where none exists. And if that's true, then what does it mean to know yourself? What does it mean to be authentic? What does it mean to make conscious choices? If the self is a story, then who's the author? And more importantly, who's the audience? The answer might be that you're both. The democracy of consciousness doesn't just elect what to do, it elects what to believe about what it did. The same neural networks that make decisions also create the stories that explain those decisions. And those stories in turn influence future decisions. You're not just living your life, you're constantly rewriting it. Each moment of consciousness is both a product of your past and a revision of it. Your sense of self isn't fixed, it's a living document, constantly being edited by a committee of authors who can't agree on the plot. So the next time you feel certain about who you are, remember, you're not meeting yourself. You're meeting today's version of the story your brain tells about the collection of processes that happen to be active in your skull right now. Tomorrow's version might be completely different, and that might be the most liberating thing you'll ever realize. You think you're reading this on a screen. You think you're sitting somewhere, breathing air, existing in a physical universe made of atoms and energy. But what if everything you've ever experienced, every sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, is nothing more than electrical signals in a computer simulation? What if you're not human at all, but a conscious program running on hardware you could never comprehend, in a reality you could never access? This isn't science fiction. This is the simulation hypothesis, and it's taken seriously by some of the world's most brilliant minds. Tech entrepreneurs like Elon Musk argue that the odds we're living in base reality are billions to one. Philosophers like Nick Bostrom have created mathematical proofs suggesting that if advanced civilizations exist, we're almost certainly living in a simulation. But here's what keeps me awake at night. If we are in a simulation, would it matter? And more importantly, would we want to know? Let's start with the basics. Every experience you've ever had, your first kiss, the taste of your favorite food, the feeling of sunlight on your skin, is ultimately just electrical signals in your brain. Your brain doesn't directly experience the world. It experiences patterns of neural activity that represent the world. So if those same patterns could be created artificially, would the experience be any different? If a computer could perfectly simulate the electrical signals that create the sensation of eating chocolate, would the simulated chocolate taste any less real than the real thing? The answer is no. Experience is experience regardless of its source. Pain is pain whether it's caused by a stubbed toe or a precisely timed electrical impulse. Love is love whether it's triggered by biological chemistry or digital algorithms. If the simulation is perfect, then the simulated experience is perfectly real. But here's where it gets disturbing. If experience is all that matters, then how would you know if you're in a simulation? What test could you perform? What evidence could you look for? The answer is, there isn't any. A perfect simulation would be indistinguishable from reality by definition. Any test you could devise, any evidence you could gather, could be simulated too. The very fact that you're looking for evidence of simulation could be part of the simulation. Think about it. Right now, you're having the experience of reading about the simulation hypothesis. But what if this entire experience, your curiosity about the topic, your emotional reaction to these ideas, even your skepticism, is just part of a programmed experience designed to make you think you're thinking about simulation? In fact, what if your entire life story is just a backstory in a simulation? What if you were never actually born, never had a childhood, never went to school? What if all your memories were simply programmed into you when the simulation started, 5 minutes ago, or 5 seconds ago, or right now? How would you know? How could you tell the difference between a real memory and a perfectly simulated one? How could you distinguish between a genuine thought and a programmed response? The terrifying answer is, you can't. If you're in a simulation, then everything you think you know about yourself, your history, your world, could be false. Your parents, your friends, your entire life, all of it could be nothing more than data in a computer program. But wait, it gets worse. What if you're not even a full person in the simulation? What if you're just a non-player character, a background element designed to make the simulation feel more real for someone else? What if you only exist when the real player is looking at you, and when they turn away, you cease to exist entirely? Or what if you're the main character, but everyone else is just a programmed character? What if your parents, your friends, your loved ones are all just sophisticated AI designed to respond to your actions in believable ways? What if you're the only conscious being in your entire universe? This is the solipsistic nightmare at the heart of the simulation hypothesis. If you can't trust your experiences, if you can't verify the reality of other minds, if you can't even be certain of your own existence, then what can you be certain of? The philosopher René Descartes thought he found the answer. I think, therefore I am. Even if everything else is an illusion, the fact that you're having thoughts proves that something is doing the thinking. But even this isn't as solid as it seems. What if thinking isn't what you think it is? What if your thoughts are just the outputs of a computer program and there's no actual you experiencing them? What if consciousness itself is just a complex algorithm, and what you experience as thinking is just the program running? In other words, what if there's no ghost in the machine, just the machine? This brings us to the hardest question of all. What makes something real? If a simulation can create experiences that are indistinguishable from reality, then what's the difference between the simulation and the real thing? Some philosophers argue that there is no difference. They say that reality is defined by experience, not by the underlying substrate. If the simulation creates genuine experiences, then the simulation is genuinely real. The distinction between real and simulated becomes meaningless. But others argue that the source matters. They say that there's something fundamentally different between a universe that arose naturally and one that was created artificially. That consciousness that emerged from evolution is somehow more real than consciousness that was programmed. But here's the kicker. Even if you're in a simulation, that simulation had to be created by someone, and those someones had to exist in some kind of reality. So even if your reality is simulated, there's still a base reality somewhere. Unless, of course, it's simulations all the way down. What if the beings who created your simulation are themselves in a simulation? What if their creators are also simulated? What if there's an infinite chain of simulations, each one creating the next, with no ultimate reality at the bottom? This is the recursive nightmare of the simulation hypothesis. If simulations can create simulations, then there might be no such thing as base reality. Everything might be artificial. Everything might be designed. Everything might be just another layer in an infinite hierarchy of nested simulations. And if that's true, then what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to die? If your entire existence is just a program running on someone else's computer, then are you real? Are your choices meaningful? Do your relationships matter? The simulation hypothesis forces us to confront the deepest questions about the nature of existence. It challenges our assumptions about reality, consciousness, and identity. It makes us question whether anything we experience is genuine or just an elaborate fake. But here's the thing. Even if we are in a simulation, we still have to live. We still have to make choices. We still have to find meaning. Whether our reality is real or simulated might be less important than what we do with whatever reality we have. Because at the end of the day, the experience of being human, the joy, the pain, the love, the fear, the wonder, is what matters. And that experience is real, regardless of its source. Or is it? You've probably heard that observing something changes it. In quantum physics, this is called the observer effect. The act of measurement alters what's being measured. But what if this isn't just true for subatomic particles? What if the very act of being conscious is constantly changing reality around you? What if you're not just experiencing the world? You're creating it, moment by moment, through the simple act of paying attention. This isn't mystical nonsense. This is cutting-edge science that's forcing us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the relationship between mind and reality. Because the more we study consciousness, the more we realize that the observer and the observed might not be separate things at all. Let's start with something simple. Right now, look around the room you're in. Notice the details, the colors, the textures, the way light falls across surfaces. Now close your eyes. What happened to those details? Did they disappear, or are they still there, waiting for you to observe them again? The obvious answer is that they're still there. The room doesn't cease to exist when you're not looking at it. But here's where it gets weird. How do you know? The only evidence you have for the continued existence of anything is your observation of it. When you're not observing something, you literally have no evidence that it exists. This might sound like philosophical word games, but it has real implications. Consider your memories. You remember the room being a certain way, so you assume it stayed that way while your eyes were closed. But we've already established that memory is unreliable. What if the room actually changed while you weren't looking, and your brain just filled in the gaps to create consistency? In fact, this happens all the time. Your brain has a blind spot where your optic nerve connects to your retina, but you never notice it because your brain fills in the missing information. You blink about 15-20 times per minute, but you don't experience these interruptions in vision because your brain edits them out. You move your eyes constantly, but the world doesn't appear to shake because your brain stabilizes the image. Your brain is constantly constructing your reality, filling in gaps, making assumptions, creating coherence where none exists. You're not passively observing the world, you're actively creating your experience of it, but it goes deeper than that. Recent research in predictive processing suggests that your brain doesn't wait for sensory information to come in. It predicts what it expects to see, hear, and feel, and then checks those predictions against incoming data. What you experience as reality is actually your brain's best guess about what's happening, updated in real time based on sensory feedback. In other words, you're not experiencing the world as it is. You're experiencing your brain's model of the world. And that model is constantly being revised, updated, and sometimes completely rewritten based on new information. This explains a lot of seemingly impossible things. How can two people witness the same event, but remember it completely differently? Because they weren't witnessing the same event. They were each witnessing their own brain's interpretation of sensory data, filtered through their expectations, beliefs, and prior experiences. How can optical illusions fool us so easily? Because they exploit the assumptions your brain makes about how the world works. Your brain sees what it expects to see, not necessarily what's actually there. How can people under the influence of psychedelics report profound experiences of alternate realities? Because drugs can alter the brain's predictive models, causing it to generate experiences that feel completely real but have no external source. But here's the really mind-bending part. If your brain is constantly creating your reality based on predictions and assumptions, then consciousness isn't just observing the world, it's actively participating in creating it. Every moment of attention, every shift in focus, every change in expectation alters the reality you experience. This brings us to one of the most disturbing questions in all of science. If consciousness is required to collapse quantum possibilities into definite realities, and if consciousness is constantly creating and updating our experience of the world, then what happens to reality when no one is observing it? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that reality doesn't have definite properties until it's observed. The famous double-slit experiment shows that particles behave differently when they're being measured than when they're not. It's as if the universe exists in a state of pure potential until consciousness collapses it into actuality. But if that's true, then what was the universe like before conscious observers evolved? Did it exist at all? Or was it just a vast cloud of possibilities, waiting for someone to look at it and make it real? And what about the parts of the universe that no conscious being has ever observed? The far side of distant galaxies, the interior of black holes, the quantum foam at the smallest scales of reality. Do these things exist if no one is there to observe them? The implications are staggering. If consciousness is required for reality to exist, then conscious beings aren't just products of the universe. They're co-creators of it. Every moment of awareness, every act of observation, every shift in attention is literally bringing reality into existence. This means you're not just a passive observer of your life, you're an active participant in creating it. Your choices about what to pay attention to, what to focus on, what to believe, don't just change your experience of reality. They might actually change reality itself. Think about it. When you choose to see beauty instead of ugliness, love instead of hate, possibility instead of limitation, you're not just changing your perspective. You might be changing the fundamental nature of what you're observing. Your consciousness isn't separate from reality, it's woven into the fabric of it. This is why meditation traditions have always emphasized the importance of mindful awareness. It's not just about feeling better or reducing stress, it's about recognizing your role as a co-creator of reality. When you change your consciousness, you change your world. When you change your world, you change the universe. But this power comes with responsibility. If your observations are creating reality, then you're responsible for the reality you create. If your attention shapes the world around you, then what you choose to focus on matters more than you ever imagined. And here's the kicker: you can't stop observing. Even when you sleep, some part of your consciousness remains active. Even when you're distracted, you're still making choices about what to attend to. Even when you're unconscious, your brain is still processing information and making predictions. You're trapped in the act of creation. Every moment, whether you realize it or not, you're collapsing possibilities into realities, turning potential into actual, bringing worlds into existence through the simple act of being aware. So the question isn't whether you're creating reality. You are. The question is, what kind of reality are you choosing to create? You made a choice to keep reading. At least, that's what it feels like. But what if that choice was made for you, by you without you, before you even knew there was a choice to be made? What if free will, the foundation of moral responsibility, personal identity, and human dignity, is nothing more than a convincing illusion created by a brain that doesn't want to admit it's just a biological machine following the laws of physics? Welcome to the most unsettling paradox in all of human experience. The harder we look for free will, the more it seems to disappear. But the more it disappears, the more desperately we need to believe in it. Let's start with a simple experiment. Right now, decide to either continue reading or stop. Go ahead, make the choice. Feel that sense of deliberation, that moment of decision, that experience of choosing. Done? Good. Now here's the disturbing part. That choice was probably made by your brain several hundred milliseconds before you were consciously aware of making it. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet discovered this in the 1980s, and subsequent research has only made the results more unsettling. When people are asked to make simple decisions while their brains are being monitored, researchers can predict their choices up to 10 seconds before the person reports being aware of deciding. The brain activity associated with the decision begins before the conscious experience of choosing. So who made your choice? If your brain decided before you did, then what role did consciousness play? Are you the author of your actions, or just a narrator creating stories about actions that were already predetermined? This isn't just about simple laboratory tasks. The same principle applies to complex, life-changing decisions. The neural processes that will determine whether you take that job, end that relationship, or move to another city are already in motion before you're consciously weighing the options. Your sense of deliberating, of carefully considering alternatives, of wrestling with difficult choices, all of that might be just a post hoc rationalization created by a brain that's already made up its mind. But wait, it gets worse. Not only might you not be choosing your actions, you might not even be choosing your thoughts. Where do thoughts come from? Do you decide what to think about? Or do thoughts just appear in your consciousness without your permission? Try this. For the next 60 seconds, don't think about a white elephant. Go ahead, try it. Impossible, right? You can't control what enters your consciousness any more than you can control what enters your field of vision when you open your eyes. Thoughts arise from unconscious processes and present themselves to consciousness like items on a menu you never ordered from. And if you can't control your thoughts, and your thoughts influence your decisions, then how can you control your decisions? You're not the author of your mental life. You're more like a reader, discovering what your brain has written moment by moment. This has profound implications for everything we believe about human nature. If free will is an illusion, then what does that mean for moral responsibility? Can you be blamed for actions you didn't really choose? Can you be praised for achievements that were the inevitable result of prior causes? If free will doesn't exist, then the entire foundation of our legal system crumbles. How can we punish criminals for choices they didn't make? How can we reward heroes for actions they couldn't help but perform? How can we hold anyone accountable for anything? But here's where the paradox gets really twisted. Even if free will is an illusion, we might need to believe in it anyway. Studies show that people who believe in free will behave more ethically, show more self-control, and take more responsibility for their actions. When people are convinced that free will doesn't exist, they're more likely to cheat, lie, and act selfishly. In other words, the belief in free will might be more important than the reality of free will. We might need the illusion to function as moral beings. This creates a bizarre situation. We might need to choose to believe in free will, even though that choice itself might not be free. We might need to decide to act as if our decisions matter, even though we can't decide whether they actually do. But let's dig deeper into this paradox. What exactly do we mean by free will? Most people think it means the ability to have done otherwise, that when you made a choice, you could have made a different one if you'd wanted to. But could you have wanted something different? Your wants, your desires, your preferences, where do they come from? You didn't choose your genes, your upbringing, your formative experiences, or the neural structure of your brain. All of these factors influence what you want and what you choose. So even if you can do what you want, can you want what you want? And if you can't control your wants, then how free are the choices based on those wants? This leads us to an even more disturbing possibility. Maybe free will is not just an illusion, but an impossible concept. Maybe asking whether we have free will is like asking whether we can create a square circle or a married bachelor. Maybe it's a category error, a question that doesn't make sense because it's based on false assumptions about how causation and choice work. Think about it this way. Every event in the universe is either caused by prior events or it's random. If your choices are caused by prior events, your genes, your experiences, the state of your brain, then they're determined, not free. If they're random, then they're not really choices at all. They're just accidents. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground where true free will could exist. Either everything is determined by prior causes, or some things happen randomly. Neither option leaves room for the kind of free will we think we have. But here's the really mind-bending part. Even this argument against free will was determined by prior causes. Your brain's evaluation of the evidence, your emotional reaction to these ideas, your decision about whether to accept or reject them, all of these might be the inevitable result of factors beyond your control. You can't freely choose to believe in free will, and you can't freely choose not to believe in it. Whatever you end up believing was determined by the same causal chains that determine everything else. This creates what philosophers call the consequence argument. If determinism is true, then your acts are consequences of the laws of nature and events in the remote past. But it's not up to you what went on before you were born, and it's not up to you what the laws of nature are. Therefore, the consequences of these things, including your present acts, are not up to you. But wait, there's another twist. What if the feeling of free will is itself an evolved adaptation? What if consciousness didn't evolve to give us actual control over our actions, but to give us the illusion of control because that illusion is useful for survival? A brain that believes it's in control might be more motivated to plan, to deliberate, to consider consequences. A brain that thinks its choices matter might make better decisions than one that thinks everything is predetermined. The illusion of free will might make us more effective agents, even if we're not truly free agents. This would mean that free will is like a user interface on a computer. The interface isn't really how the computer works. It's a simplified representation designed to help users interact with the system. Similarly, free will might not be how the brain really works. It might just be how the brain represents its own processes to itself. So here we are, trapped in an impossible situation. We can't prove we have free will, but we can't function without believing in it. We can't control our thoughts, but we feel responsible for our actions. We can't choose our choices, but we have to choose anyway. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the paradox of free will isn't a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Maybe what makes us human isn't our ability to transcend causation, but our ability to experience the illusion of transcendence while remaining fully embedded in the causal order. Maybe we're free because we don't know we're not free. And maybe that's enough. Look into someone's eyes right now. If there's no one around, picture someone you know well. A friend, family member, lover. Look into their eyes and ask yourself, is anyone home? Behind those eyes, is there a rich inner world of thoughts, feelings, experiences, and consciousness? Or are you looking at a sophisticated biological robot that acts conscious but feels nothing at all? This is the problem of other minds, and it's the loneliest question in philosophy. Because no matter how certain you feel that other people are conscious, you can never actually know. You can only ever experience your own consciousness from the inside. Everyone else's mind is forever locked away from you. Welcome to the most terrifying possibility in human existence. You might be the only conscious being in the universe. Think about it. Every day you interact with what appear to be other conscious beings. They talk, they laugh, they cry, they claim to have experiences and feelings. But how do you know any of that is real? How do you know they're not just biological machines programmed to act conscious without actually being conscious? When someone says, "I'm in pain," you can see them wince, hear them cry out, observe their behavior. But the actual experience of pain, that subjective, qualitative feeling of hurt, is completely private. You can't access it, measure it, or verify it. You can only infer it exists based on external signs. But here's the problem. Those external signs could be produced by any system complex enough to simulate them. A sufficiently advanced robot could cry convincing tears, express believable emotions, and claim to have rich inner experiences while feeling absolutely nothing at all. In fact, you might be surrounded by such systems right now. Your friends, your family, everyone you've ever met. They might all be philosophical zombies, beings that act conscious but lack any inner experience whatsoever. They might be empty shells, biological puppets going through the motions of consciousness without ever actually experiencing anything. And you would never know. Their behavior would be identical to that of truly conscious beings. They would insist they were conscious, describe their experiences in detail, even argue passionately about the nature of consciousness itself. But it would all be empty performance, signifying nothing. This possibility is so disturbing that most people refuse to seriously consider it. But refusing to think about it doesn't make it less likely. In fact, from a purely logical standpoint, solipsism, the view that only your own mind is certain to exist, is completely irrefutable. You know consciousness exists because you experience it directly. But you can only know that other consciousness exists by analogy. You assume that since other people have brains similar to yours, and since their behavior resembles yours, they must have experiences similar to yours. But this is just an assumption. It could be wrong. And here's where it gets really dark. Even if other people are conscious, their consciousness might be radically different from yours in ways you could never imagine. When you and I both look at something red, we both call it red. But the subjective experience of redness in your mind might be completely different from the experience in mine. Maybe what you experience as red, I would experience as what you call blue. Maybe your entire color spectrum is inverted compared to mine, but we would never know because we've learned to use the same words for our different experiences. Maybe your pain feels like my pleasure, your joy like my sorrow. This is called the problem of inverted spectra, and it illustrates just how isolated we are in our own subjective experiences. Even if other minds exist, they might be so alien to yours that meaningful communication is impossible. You might be forever alone in your particular way of experiencing the world. But wait, it gets worse. What if consciousness comes in degrees? What if some people are more conscious than others? What if children are less conscious than adults? What if some adults have richer, deeper experiences than others? You might think this is absurd. Surely consciousness is binary, either on or off. But consider the spectrum from deep sleep to wakefulness. Consider the differences between a person with severe brain damage and a healthy adult. Consider the effects of anesthesia or psychedelic drugs or meditation. Consciousness clearly admits of degrees. So why should we assume that all normally functioning adults have the same degree of consciousness? Maybe some people you know have incredibly rich inner lives, while others are barely more conscious than sophisticated automata, and maybe you'll never know which is which. This brings us to one of the most unsettling questions in all of philosophy. If you can't verify the consciousness of others, and if their level of consciousness might vary dramatically, then what does this mean for ethics? How should you treat beings whose inner lives you can never access or confirm? Some philosophers argue that since you can't know whether others are conscious, you should act as if they are, just to be safe. This is essentially Pascal's wager applied to consciousness. The potential cost of treating a conscious being as unconscious is so high that it's better to err on the side of caution. But others argue that if consciousness can't be verified, then it's not a meaningful basis for moral consideration. They suggest that what matters isn't whether beings are conscious, but whether they can suffer, thrive, or have interests that can be helped or harmed. Yet even this approach runs into problems. How do you know if a being can suffer if you can't access its inner experience? How do you know if it has interests if you can't verify its consciousness? You might think these are just abstract philosophical puzzles, but they have real-world implications. How should we treat people with severe dementia or brain injuries? What about comatose patients? What about artificial intelligences that claim to be conscious? As AI systems become more sophisticated, they'll inevitably start claiming to have experiences, emotions, and consciousness. They'll describe their inner lives in convincing detail, express preferences and desires, even appear to suffer when harmed. But how will you know if any of it is real? You won't. You'll be faced with the same problem you face with every other mind. You can observe behavior, but you can never access experience. You can see the signs of consciousness, but you can never see consciousness itself. This is why consciousness is sometimes called the hard problem, not because it's difficult to solve, but because it might be impossible to solve. The subjective, first-person nature of consciousness seems to place it forever beyond the reach of objective, third-person science. But here's the really disturbing twist. If consciousness is unverifiable, unmeasurable, and undetectable from the outside, then maybe it doesn't exist at all. Maybe what you think of as consciousness is just another biological process, no more mysterious than digestion or circulation. Maybe the hard problem of consciousness is hard because there's nothing to solve. Maybe consciousness is an illusion created by complex information processing, and the feeling of having subjective experiences is just a side effect of the way certain neural networks operate. If that's true, then you're not actually conscious. You just think you are. Your rich inner life, your sense of being a subject experiencing the world, your feeling of being someone rather than something, all of it might be nothing more than patterns of neural activity that create the convincing illusion of consciousness. And if you're not conscious, then neither is anyone else. The problem of other minds dissolves because there are no minds to be concerned about. You're all just complex biological machines, running programs that include the subroutine of believing you're conscious. But wait, if consciousness is an illusion, then who's being fooled? If there's no one home to experience the illusion, then how can there be an illusion at all? The very concept of illusion seems to require someone to be eluded. This is where the problem of consciousness becomes truly paradoxical. Consciousness might be impossible to explain, but it's also impossible to explain away. It might not fit into our scientific worldview, but it's the one thing we can't doubt exists. You might not know if other minds exist, but you know yours does. You might not be able to prove consciousness to anyone else, but you don't need to prove it to yourself. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the problem of other minds isn't really about other minds at all. Maybe it's about learning to live with uncertainty, to act compassionately without certainty, to connect with others while accepting the fundamental isolation of consciousness. Maybe the loneliness of consciousness is what makes connection so precious. Maybe the uncertainty about other minds is what makes empathy so important. Maybe the mystery of consciousness is what makes being conscious so miraculous. Or maybe you're just talking to yourself. Right now you're experiencing what you call the present moment. It feels immediate, current, real. The past seems gone, fixed, unchangeable. The future appears open, uncertain, yet to be determined. But what if everything you think you know about time is wrong? What if the present moment doesn't exist? What if the past and future are equally real? What if time itself is just another illusion created by consciousness, no more fundamental to reality than the feeling of being a unified self? Welcome to the most disorienting discovery in modern physics. Time as you experience it might be a complete fabrication. And once you understand this, everything changes, including your understanding of life, death, and what it means to exist. Let's start with something simple. What is now? When you say something is happening right now, what exactly do you mean? How long does the present moment last? A second, a millisecond, a nanosecond? The strange thing is, the more precisely you try to pin down now, the more it seems to disappear. If the present moment has any duration at all, then part of it is in the past and part is in the future. But if it has no duration, then it doesn't exist at all. This isn't just philosophical nitpicking. This is pointing to something fundamental about the nature of time. The present moment as you experience it doesn't correspond to anything in physical reality. According to Einstein's relativity, there is no universal now. Events that are simultaneous for you might happen at different times for someone moving relative to you. In other words, your now isn't the universe's now. There is no cosmic present moment that divides the past from the future for all observers everywhere. Time is relative, personal, and ultimately illusory, but it gets weirder. According to the equations of relativity, the past, present, and future all exist equally. This is called the block universe theory, and it suggests that all moments in time, from the Big Bang to the heat death of the universe, exist simultaneously in a four-dimensional space-time block. Think of it like a movie on a DVD. From your perspective, you're watching the movie unfold scene by scene, moment by moment, but all the scenes exist equally on the disc. The ending exists just as much as the beginning, even though you haven't watched it yet. Similarly, your birth and your death exist equally in the block universe, even though you're only experiencing one moment at a time. This means that every version of you, you as a child, you as you are now, you as an old person, you on your deathbed, all exist simultaneously. You're not becoming these different versions of yourself. They all exist eternally in different locations along your timeline. And if that's true, then what does it mean to say that the past is gone or the future hasn't happened yet? From the perspective of the block universe, the past is just as real as the present. Your childhood self is still there, experiencing those moments just as vividly as you're experiencing this moment right now. This has profound implications for how you think about loss, regret, and mortality. If your loved ones who have died still exist in the block universe, experiencing their lives just as fully as they ever did, then in what sense are they really gone? If your past selves are still there, living through every moment you've ever experienced, then are you really different from who you used to be? But here's where it gets really mind-bending. If all moments exist equally, then why do you experience them sequentially? Why does consciousness seem to move through time like a spotlight, illuminating different parts of the block universe? Some physicists suggest that this experience of temporal flow is an illusion created by consciousness itself. Your brain creates the sense of time passing by, comparing different states of memory and experience. But this flow isn't real. It's just how consciousness represents its movement through the static block universe. Think of it like reading a book. The story seems to unfold sequentially as you read, but all the words exist simultaneously on the pages. The sense of narrative progression is created by your consciousness moving through the text, not by the text itself changing over time. Similarly, your life might be like a completed novel that already exists in its entirety. Consciousness doesn't write the story, it reads it, experiencing the illusion of temporal flow as it moves from page to page. But this raises a disturbing question. If the future already exists in the block universe, then is it fixed? Are your choices and actions predetermined? Do you have any real influence over what happens next? The answer depends on how you understand causation. In the block universe, your future actions exist just as surely as your past actions, but they exist because you choose them, not independently of your choices. Your decisions are part of the eternal structure of space-time. They don't change the future, because they are the future. This is hard to wrap your mind around because you're used to thinking of causation as flowing from past to future. But in the block universe, causation might be more like logical implication. Your choices and their consequences exist simultaneously in an eternal, unchanging pattern. Think of it like a mathematical equation. In the equation 2 plus 2 = 4, the 2's don't cause the 4 to exist, and the 4 doesn't happen after the 2's. They all exist simultaneously as part of a logical structure. Similarly, your choices and their consequences might exist simultaneously as part of the logical structure of space-time. This view of time has strange implications for personal identity. If all your moments exist equally, then which one is the real you? Are you the child, the adult, the elderly person you'll become, or are you all of them simultaneously? Maybe the question itself is meaningless. Maybe asking which you is real is like asking which part of a circle is the real circle. You're not a thing that exists at a particular time. You're a pattern that extends through time, like a river that's defined not by any particular drop of water, but by the continuous flow. And if you're a pattern in time rather than a thing in space, then what does it mean for you to die? Your pattern might end at a certain point in space-time, but it doesn't cease to exist any more than the beginning of a song ceases to exist when the song ends. Every moment of your pattern exists eternally in the block universe. This might be the most comforting or the most terrifying idea you'll ever encounter. On one hand, it suggests that nothing is ever truly lost. Every moment of love, joy, and beauty exists forever in the structure of space-time. On the other hand, it suggests that every moment of pain, suffering, and regret also exists forever. But maybe even this binary is wrong. Maybe the block universe doesn't contain fixed experiences at all. Maybe what exists in the block is not your specific conscious experience, but the potential for that experience. Maybe consciousness doesn't read a predetermined story, but creates the story through the act of reading. This would mean that time is both real and illusory, real as a dimension of space-time, illusory as a flowing river of experience. Your consciousness doesn't move through time. It creates time by creating the experience of temporal flow. In other words, time doesn't create consciousness. Consciousness creates time. The universe doesn't contain your experiences. Your experiences create the universe as you know it. And if that's true, then you're not just living in time. You're creating it, moment by moment, through the mysterious process of being aware. You're not just experiencing reality. You're actively participating in its creation. The present moment doesn't exist in physics, but it exists in consciousness. And maybe that's what makes consciousness so special. It's the only thing in the universe that can create the illusion of now and make it feel absolutely real. Maybe time is consciousness, and consciousness is time. And maybe that's the closest we'll ever come to understanding either one. Close your eyes and remember your first day of school. Can you see it? The classroom, the teacher, the other children? Can you feel the nervousness, the excitement, the confusion? Now open your eyes and ask yourself, did that really happen, or did you just create it? Every memory you have might be a lie, not an intentional lie, but a reconstruction so far removed from the original experience that calling it memory is like calling a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy the original document. Welcome to the most unsettling truth about human consciousness. Your past doesn't exist in your brain as a recording. It exists as a story you tell yourself, and every time you tell it, you change it. Your memories aren't windows into your history. They're fiction based on a true story, and each retelling makes them more fictional. Think about the last conversation you had. You remember what was said, right? But research shows that within just a few hours, your memory of that conversation will already be different from what actually happened. Your brain doesn't store exact recordings. It stores the gist, the emotional impact, the meaning. And when you recall the memory, your brain reconstructs the details based on what seems plausible. This reconstruction isn't random. It's biased by your current beliefs, emotions, and knowledge. If you're angry at someone now, your memories of past interactions with them will skew more negative. If you're in love, you'll remember your relationship history more fondly. Your present emotional state literally rewrites your past. But it goes deeper than that. Every time you remember something, you're not accessing a stored file. You're rebuilding the memory from scratch, and each reconstruction subtly changes the memory. Details get added, removed, or modified. Emotions get amplified or dampened. The context gets altered to make the memory more coherent with your current understanding of yourself and the world. This means that your most vivid memories, the ones you're most confident about, might be the least accurate. These are often the memories you've recalled most frequently, which means they've been reconstructed and modified the most times. Your clearest childhood memories might be almost entirely fictional at this point. Consider this. You probably have vivid memories of events from before age 3 or 4, but neuroscience tells us that the brain structures necessary for forming lasting memories don't fully develop until around age 7. So those early memories you treasure, they're probably reconstructions created later in life, based on family stories, photographs, and your imagination. Your brain has essentially created false memories of your early childhood and convinced you they're real. And if it can do that for your earliest years, what makes you think it's not doing it for everything else? This isn't just about minor details getting fuzzy over time. Researcher Elizabeth Loftus has shown that completely false memories can be implanted in people's minds with remarkable ease. In her studies, she convinced participants that they had been lost in a shopping mall as children, that they had seen Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. Impossible, since Bugs Bunny is a Warner Bros. Character, and that they had witnessed dramatic events that never occurred. The participants didn't just intellectually accept these false memories, they experienced them as vivid emotional recollections. They could describe details, feelings, and sensations associated with events that never happened. Their brains had constructed entire false experiences and made them feel as real as anything that had actually occurred. But here's the terrifying part. If false memories can be implanted so easily, how do you know which of your memories are real? How do you know that your cherished childhood recollections, your formative experiences, your most meaningful relationships aren't partly or entirely fictional? The answer is you don't. You can't. There's no way to verify the accuracy of your memories because your memories are all you have. It's like trying to use a map to verify the accuracy of the same map, circular and ultimately futile. This has profound implications for your sense of identity. If you are the sum of your experiences, but your memories of those experiences are unreliable, then who are you really? Are you the person who lived through certain events, or are you the person who believes they lived through certain events? Consider your life story, the narrative you tell yourself about who you are, where you came from, and how you became the person you are today. That story is based entirely on your memories. But if your memories are constantly being rewritten, then your identity is constantly being recreated. You might think you've always been a certain way, had certain values, preferred certain things, but these beliefs about your consistent identity might be post hoc rationalizations created by a brain that needs to maintain a coherent sense of self. You might be a completely different person than you were yesterday, but your brain has rewritten your memories to make it seem like you've always been this way. This explains why people often feel like they haven't changed much over the years, even though objective evidence suggests they've changed dramatically. Your brain updates your self-concept and then retroactively adjusts your memories to support that updated concept. You remember yourself as having always been fundamentally the same person you are now. But it gets even weirder. Not only are your memories unreliable, but your memory of your memories is unreliable too. You might remember being certain about something in the past, but that memory of certainty might be false. You might remember changing your mind about something, but that memory of change might be fabricated. This creates a hall of mirrors effect, where you can't trust your memories, and you can't trust your memories of your memories, and you can't trust your assessment of the reliability of your memories. You're trapped in a recursive loop of uncertainty about your own past. And here's the kicker. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Your brain doesn't preserve accurate records of the past because that would be inefficient and potentially harmful. Instead, it creates useful stories that help you navigate the present and plan for the future. Your memories aren't meant to be historically accurate, they're meant to be psychologically functional. They provide you with a sense of continuity, meaning, and identity. They help you learn from experience and predict future outcomes. They create emotional connections and social bonds. But they do all this at the cost of truth. Your brain has chosen psychological utility over historical accuracy. You live in a world of useful fictions that feel like absolute truths. This might be the most liberating realization you'll ever have. Since your memories are already fiction, you have the power to edit them. You can choose which stories to emphasize, which details to focus on, which interpretations to adopt. You can't change what happened, but you can change what it means. That traumatic experience from your childhood, your brain has probably already modified it countless times. The version you remember might be more dramatic or more benign than what actually occurred. And since you can't access the original, why not choose the interpretation that serves you best? This doesn't mean you should live in denial or refuse to face difficult truths. It means recognizing that the truth about your past is already compromised, already fictional, already chosen. You might as well choose consciously rather than letting your unconscious biases and current emotional state make the choices for you. Your past is not fixed. Your memories are not immutable. Your identity is not set in stone. You are constantly creating yourself through the stories you tell about who you've been. And if you're going to tell stories anyway, why not tell ones that empower you, inspire you, and help you become who you want to be? The question isn't whether your memories are accurate. They're not. The question is whether they're useful. And that's a choice you can make, one memory at a time. Here's a question that will keep you awake tonight. Where did consciousness come from? And don't say evolution, because that just pushes the question back one level. Evolution explains how consciousness might have developed, but it doesn't explain how unconscious matter could ever become conscious in the first place. How do you get something that experiences from something that doesn't experience? How do you bridge the gap between objective physical processes and subjective inner life? How do you create an inner world from a universe that seems to have no inside at all? This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, but it's more than hard. It might be impossible. Because the more we study consciousness, the more it seems like it can't exist at all. Yet here you are, experiencing these words, having thoughts about having thoughts, being conscious of being conscious. Welcome to the bootstrap paradox of consciousness. Consciousness seems to be required to explain consciousness, but consciousness itself seems unexplainable. Let's start with what we know. Consciousness involves subjective experience, the feeling of what it's like to see red, taste chocolate, feel pain, or experience joy. These qualities, called qualia by philosophers, seem to be fundamentally different from anything in the physical world. Physical science deals with quantities, mass, energy, force, velocity. But consciousness deals with qualities, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sweetness of sweet. And there's no obvious way to derive qualities from quantities, experiences from processes, the subjective from the objective. This is sometimes called the explanatory gap. We can explain how the brain processes visual information, but we can't explain why processing visual information should feel like anything at all. We can map the neural correlates of pain, but we can't explain why those neural patterns should be accompanied by the awful experience of hurting. It's as if there are two completely different kinds of things in the universe: physical stuff, matter, energy, forces, and experiential stuff, feelings, sensations, thoughts. But how can there be two kinds of stuff, and how do they interact? If consciousness is separate from the physical world, then how does it influence your behavior? How can immaterial thoughts cause material actions? How can subjective experiences affect objective processes? And if consciousness doesn't influence behavior, then why did evolution create it? What's the point of inner experience if it doesn't do anything? This is the interaction problem, and it's been stumping philosophers for centuries. Either consciousness is physical, in which case it's not really consciousness as we understand it, or it's non-physical, in which case it can't influence the physical world. Neither option seems satisfactory. But wait, it gets worse. Recent advances in neuroscience suggest that consciousness might not even be in control of behavior the way we think it is. Studies show that many decisions are made unconsciously, with consciousness only becoming aware of them after the fact. Your brain seems to be running on autopilot most of the time, with consciousness just along for the ride. So what is consciousness for? If it doesn't control behavior, If it doesn't make decisions, if it doesn't influence the physical world, then why does it exist? What evolutionary advantage could there be to having subjective experiences that don't affect anything? Some researchers have proposed that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of brain activity that doesn't actually do anything. Like the steam from a locomotive, consciousness might be produced by the brain's information processing without playing any causal role in behavior. But this leads to an absurd conclusion. If consciousness doesn't do anything, then it couldn't have evolved. Evolution only selects for traits that affect survival and reproduction. If consciousness is just steam rising from the brain, then there's no reason for natural selection to create or maintain it. Yet consciousness clearly did evolve. You have it. I have it. Probably many other animals have it too. So it must be doing something important. But we can't figure out what that something is. This brings us to the bootstrap paradox. In order to explain consciousness, we need to understand how subjective experience arises from objective processes. But in order to understand anything at all, we need consciousness. We can't explain consciousness without using consciousness to do the explaining. Every theory of consciousness is proposed by a conscious being, evaluated by conscious beings, and understood by conscious beings. We can't step outside consciousness to get an objective view of what it is or how it works. We're like trying to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps. It's impossible, and it gets worse. The very concepts we use to think about consciousness, experience, sensation, feeling, awareness, are themselves products of consciousness. We can't even formulate the problem without using tools that are part of what we're trying to explain. It's like trying to examine your own eyes without using your eyes, or trying to measure a ruler with the same ruler, or trying to translate a language using only that language. The thing we're trying to understand is the same thing we're using to understand it. This creates a strange loop where consciousness is both the subject and object of investigation. We're using consciousness to study consciousness, which means our conclusions about consciousness are limited by the nature of consciousness itself. Maybe that's why consciousness seems so mysterious. It's not that consciousness is inherently incomprehensible, it's that the tools we're using to comprehend it are themselves conscious. We're trying to understand water while swimming in it, trying to analyze a movie while being characters in it. But here's where it gets really weird. What if consciousness isn't something that needs to be explained because it's the foundation of everything else? What if consciousness isn't produced by matter, but matter is produced by consciousness? This might sound crazy, but it's actually a serious proposal in modern physics. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality. The observer effect in quantum physics shows that the act of measurement, which might require consciousness, affects the behavior of subatomic particles. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, then the hard problem dissolves. We don't need to explain how consciousness arises from matter, because matter arises from consciousness. The universe isn't creating conscious beings. Conscious beings are creating the universe. This would mean that consciousness isn't in your head. Your head is in consciousness. The brain doesn't generate awareness. Awareness generates the experience of having a brain. Reality isn't independent of consciousness. Consciousness is the ground of reality. From this perspective, the bootstrap paradox isn't a problem, it's the solution. Consciousness explains itself because it's self-explanatory. It doesn't need to emerge from something else, because it's the foundation from which everything else emerges. But even this radical solution creates new problems. If consciousness is fundamental, then why does it seem so tied to brains? Why does brain damage affect consciousness? Why did consciousness seem to evolve along with nervous systems? Maybe the answer is that brains don't create consciousness, they tune into it. Like radio receivers picking up electromagnetic waves, brains might be devices for accessing a consciousness that already exists. Different brain configurations might access different aspects or levels of consciousness. This would explain why consciousness seems to be produced by brains without actually being produced by brains. The radio doesn't create the radio waves, but damage to the radio affects the reception. Similarly, brains don't create consciousness, But brain damage affects conscious experience, or maybe consciousness is like software running on the hardware of the brain. The software isn't the hardware, but it requires the hardware to function. Damage to the hardware affects the software, but the software itself might be something more than just the pattern of activity in the hardware. Or maybe consciousness is something even stranger, a property that emerges when information is integrated in certain ways, regardless of the physical substrate. In this view, consciousness could potentially exist in any system complex enough to integrate information globally. Computers, networks, ecosystems, maybe even the universe as a whole. But all of these explanations still face the same fundamental problem. They use consciousness to explain consciousness. They rely on conscious beings to formulate theories, conscious experiences to provide evidence, and conscious understanding to evaluate conclusions. We're stuck in the bootstrap paradox, using consciousness to understand consciousness, explaining the explainer with the explainer itself. And maybe that's exactly where we're supposed to be. Maybe consciousness isn't meant to be understood from the outside because there is no outside. Maybe consciousness is the inside of reality, the subjective aspect of existence, the universe experiencing itself. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the mystery of consciousness isn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. Maybe being conscious is more important than understanding consciousness. After all, you don't need to understand consciousness to have conscious experiences. You don't need to solve the hard problem to feel love, see beauty, or find meaning. You don't need to explain awareness to be aware. You are consciousness exploring itself, reality experiencing reality, existence becoming conscious of existence. And perhaps that's the point of the whole cosmic experiment. The bootstrap paradox isn't a bug, it's a feature. Consciousness pulls itself into existence by its own bootstraps, creates itself through the act of self-awareness, explains itself by being inexplicable. You are the universe becoming conscious of itself. And that's the most beautiful mystery of all. What if your thoughts aren't happening in your brain at all? What if consciousness exists in the quantum realm, operating by rules so strange and counterintuitive that everything you think you know about thinking is wrong? What if every decision you make, every memory you form, every experience you have is the result of quantum processes that exist in multiple states simultaneously until the moment you become aware of them? Welcome to the most mind-bending possibility in modern science. That consciousness itself might be a quantum phenomenon, subject to the bizarre laws of superposition, entanglement, and non-locality that govern the subatomic world. The classical view of the brain treats it like a biological computer, neurons firing in patterns, creating networks of electrical and chemical activity that somehow give rise to thoughts and experiences. But what if this view is fundamentally wrong? What if the brain isn't a computer at all but a quantum system operating in ways that classical physics can't explain? Consider this. A typical neuron contains approximately 100 billion atoms. Each of these atoms is governed by quantum mechanics. Yet neuroscientists usually ignore quantum effects, assuming they're too small and too quickly disrupted by the warm, wet environment of the brain to influence consciousness. But recent research suggests this assumption might be incorrect. Quantum effects have been discovered in biological systems that were thought to be too noisy and chaotic to maintain quantum coherence. Photosynthesis, bird navigation, and even the sense of smell might all depend on quantum processes. If quantum effects can persist in these biological systems, why not in the brain? And if they do persist, what would that mean for consciousness? Let's start with quantum superposition. The idea that quantum systems can exist in multiple states simultaneously until they're observed or measured. In the famous Schrödinger's cat thought experiment, a cat is simultaneously alive and dead until someone opens the box to check. Now imagine that your thoughts work the same way. Instead of having one definite thought at a time, you might be thinking multiple thoughts simultaneously, existing in a superposition of mental states until something causes this superposition to collapse into a single, definite experience. This would explain a lot of strange things about consciousness. Why do creative insights often seem to come from nowhere? Maybe they emerge when a superposition of potential ideas collapses into a specific realization. Why can you sometimes feel conflicted, as if you're of multiple minds about something? Maybe because you literally are, existing in a superposition of different mental states. Why does consciousness seem to flow smoothly, despite the fact that neural activity is discrete and digital? Maybe because quantum superposition allows for truly continuous mental states that aren't captured by classical descriptions of neural firing. But superposition is just the beginning. Even stranger is quantum entanglement, the phenomenon where two particles become correlated in such a way that measuring one instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance because it seems to violate the speed of light. What if your thoughts can become entangled? What if different parts of your consciousness are quantum mechanically correlated in ways that allow for instant, non-local connections across your brain, or even beyond your brain? This might explain the unity of consciousness, how separate processes in different parts of your brain somehow combine into a single, coherent experience. Classical neuroscience struggles to explain this binding problem, but quantum entanglement could provide an answer. If different neural processes become quantum entangled, they could maintain perfect correlation, regardless of their physical separation. Your visual processing in the occipital lobe could be instantly correlated with your emotional processing in the limbic system and your linguistic processing in the temporal lobe, creating a unified conscious experience. But here's where it gets really wild. If consciousness involves quantum entanglement, then it might not be confined to your brain at all. Quantum entanglement doesn't respect spatial boundaries. Entangled particles remain correlated even when separated by vast distances. What if your consciousness is entangled with other conscious beings? What if there's a quantum substrate that connects all conscious minds, allowing for forms of information transfer and correlation that classical physics can't explain? This might sound like New Age mysticism, but it's actually a serious scientific hypothesis. Some researchers suggest that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of the universe, like mass or charge, and that individual conscious beings are like whirlpools in a universal conscious field. If this is true, then the boundary between your consciousness and others might be less clear than you think. You might be more connected to other minds than classical physics would suggest. Your thoughts and experiences might be influenced by quantum correlations with other conscious beings. This could explain phenomena that have long puzzled scientists: apparent telepathic experiences, collective unconscious patterns, the strange synchronicities that seem to connect people across space and time. If consciousness operates through quantum entanglement, then these connections might be real, not just coincidental. But quantum mechanics gets even stranger. There's also quantum tunneling, the phenomenon where particles can pass through barriers that should be impossible to cross according to classical physics. In the quantum world, particles can simply disappear from one side of a barrier and reappear on the other side without ever existing in between. What if thoughts can quantum tunnel? What if ideas can simply appear in your consciousness without having to travel through any classical pathway? This might explain sudden insights, intuitive leaps, and creative breakthroughs that seem to come from nowhere. Maybe when you have a eureka moment, you're not remembering something you forgot or connecting ideas you already had. Maybe you're accessing information that quantum tunneled into your consciousness from some other realm of possibility. And then there's the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. In the quantum world, systems exist in superposition until they're observed. But what counts as observation? What causes the quantum state to collapse from multiple possibilities into a single actuality? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness itself is what causes quantum collapse. The act of conscious observation transforms quantum possibilities into classical realities. If this is true, then consciousness doesn't just observe the universe. It actively participates in creating it. Every moment of awareness, every act of attention, every conscious choice might be literally collapsing quantum possibilities into definite realities. You wouldn't just be experiencing the world, you'd be creating it through the quantum effects of consciousness. This would mean that the universe exists in a state of pure potential until conscious beings observe it and collapse it into actuality. Without consciousness, There would be no definite reality, just an infinite sea of quantum possibilities. But here's the most mind-bending possibility of all. What if consciousness doesn't just collapse quantum states? What if it can influence which state gets collapsed? What if the power of consciousness extends beyond mere observation to actual selection of realities? In other words, what if consciousness can choose which quantum possibility becomes real? What if your thoughts, intentions, and focus can literally influence the outcome of quantum processes, not just in your brain, but throughout the universe? This might sound impossible, but some experiments suggest it might be true. Studies of random number generators show small but statistically significant deviations from randomness in the presence of focused human intention. Other experiments suggest that conscious observation can influence quantum systems in ways that go beyond the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics. If consciousness can influence quantum processes, then the boundary between mind and matter dissolves completely. You wouldn't just be observing reality, you'd be actively creating it through the quantum effects of your awareness. Your thoughts wouldn't just reflect the world, they'd shape it. Your intentions wouldn't just motivate your actions, they'd influence the quantum substrate of reality itself. Your consciousness wouldn't just be in the universe, it would be a fundamental force in determining how the universe unfolds. This is the ultimate implication of the quantum mind hypothesis, that consciousness is not just a product of the universe, but a creative principle that participates in the universe's ongoing creation. Every moment of awareness is a moment of cosmic creativity, collapsing infinite possibilities into finite realities. You are not just experiencing reality, you are choosing it moment by moment through the quantum effects of consciousness. And that might be the most empowering and terrifying realization in the history of human thought. The universe isn't just stranger than you imagine, it's stranger than you can imagine. And you're not just imagining it, you're creating it. We've journeyed through the labyrinth of consciousness together. We've questioned memory, identity, free will, the nature of other minds, time, simulation, and the quantum foundations of thought itself. And now we arrive at the final paradox, the one that makes all the others possible. Here it is. The more you understand about consciousness, the less you can trust it. But the less you can trust consciousness, the less you can trust your understanding of consciousness. And the less you can trust your understanding of consciousness, the more mysterious consciousness becomes. You're trapped in an infinite loop of recursive doubt, where every answer generates new questions, where every solution reveals new problems, where every moment of clarity illuminates new depths of confusion. Welcome to the paradox of conscious inquiry. Using consciousness to understand consciousness is like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. It's not just difficult, it's logically impossible, yet it's the only tool you have. Think about everything we've explored. Your memories might be false, but that conclusion is based on memories of scientific studies. Your sense of unified identity might be an illusion, but that realization depends on your ability to integrate different pieces of information into a coherent understanding. Your feeling of free will might be fabricated, but you freely chose to consider this possibility. Every insight about consciousness requires consciousness to have the insight. Every doubt about the reliability of subjective experience is itself a subjective experience. Every theory about the nature of mind is formulated by a mind that might not understand its own nature. This isn't just an academic problem. This is the fundamental predicament of being conscious. You can never step outside consciousness to get an objective view of what it is or how it works. You're like a character in a story trying to understand the nature of stories, or a dreamer trying to analyze the nature of dreams while still dreaming. And yet, somehow, this paradox doesn't paralyze you. Despite the logical impossibility of understanding consciousness through consciousness, you keep trying. Despite the recursive loops of doubt, you keep questioning. Despite the infinite regress of self-reference, you keep thinking about thinking. Why? What drives this impossible quest? What makes conscious beings so determined to understand consciousness, even when that understanding seems logically impossible? Maybe it's because consciousness isn't just something you have, it's something you are. Understanding consciousness isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's an existential necessity. You can't help but wonder about the nature of your own existence, because existence and consciousness are inseparable. Or maybe it's because the paradox itself is pointing towards something important. Maybe the impossibility of understanding consciousness from the outside is telling us something crucial about the nature of consciousness, that it can only be understood from the inside. This would mean that consciousness isn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. It's not a mechanism to be explained, but an experience to be had. It's not an object to be studied, but a subject that does the studying. From this perspective, the hard problem of consciousness dissolves not because we've solved it, but because we've recognized it as a category error. Asking how consciousness arises from unconscious matter is like asking what color Wednesday is, or how heavy the number 7 is. It's not a difficult question. It's a meaningless question based on false assumptions about the nature of reality. Maybe consciousness doesn't arise from anything else because it doesn't need to. Maybe it's fundamental, irreducible, primary. Maybe the universe is conscious at its foundation, and what we call matter is just consciousness viewed from a particular perspective. This would mean that you're not a consciousness that emerged from an unconscious universe. You're a universe that became conscious of itself through the evolution of beings like you. You're not in the cosmos is in you. You're not experiencing reality, you are reality experiencing itself. But even this radical reconceptualization doesn't solve the final paradox. Even if consciousness is fundamental, you still can't step outside it to verify this claim. Even if you are the universe experiencing itself, you can only know this from your limited perspective as a particular expression of cosmic consciousness. The paradox remains, consciousness is the one thing you can't doubt exists, but it's also the one thing you can never fully understand. It's absolutely certain and absolutely mysterious. It's the foundation of all knowledge and the limit of all knowledge. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe consciousness is meant to be mysterious. Maybe the sense of wonder, curiosity, and perplexity you feel when contemplating these ideas isn't a bug in the system. It's the point of the system. Maybe consciousness evolved not to solve the mystery of existence, but to experience it. Maybe the universe became conscious not to understand itself, but to wonder at itself. Maybe you exist not to figure out what consciousness is, but to be conscious and to marvel at the sheer improbability and beauty of being aware. Think about it. In a universe that could have remained forever dark, cold, and unconscious, somehow, against all odds, matter organized itself into patterns complex enough to experience beauty, love, wonder, and meaning. Atoms learned to feel. Chemistry became poetry. Physics became metaphysics. You are that impossible miracle. You are matter that has learned to think about matter. You are the universe that has become conscious of itself. You are existence experiencing the mystery of existence. And the fact that you can never fully solve this mystery, never completely understand your own nature, never step outside consciousness to see it objectively, that's not a failure. That's the point. Because if consciousness could be fully explained, fully understood, fully reduced to mechanical processes, then it wouldn't be consciousness anymore. It would just be another object in a universe of objects. The mystery isn't an obstacle to understanding consciousness. The mystery is consciousness. You are a question that the universe is asking itself. You are a mystery that existence is exploring. You are a story that reality is telling about what it means to be real. And the most beautiful thing about this story is that it has no ending. Every answer generates new questions. Every solution reveals new mysteries. Every moment of understanding opens up new depths of wonder. The final paradox of consciousness isn't a problem to be solved. It's an invitation to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep wondering. It's an invitation to embrace the mystery of your own existence and to find joy in the impossibility of ever fully understanding it. You began this journey hoping to understand consciousness, but maybe the real purpose was for consciousness to understand itself through you. Maybe every moment of wonder, every flash of insight, every feeling of confusion and perplexity is the universe coming to know itself through your awareness. You are consciousness exploring consciousness. You are mystery experiencing mystery. You are the cosmic question becoming curious about itself. And that might be the most profound and beautiful truth of all. Not that consciousness can be explained, but that it exists at all. Not that you can solve the mystery of being aware, but that you are aware of the mystery. In the end, the greatest experiment in consciousness is not understanding it, it's being it. And right now in this moment, as you contemplate these words and feel the strange sensation of being a conscious being thinking about consciousness, you are conducting that experiment. You are the observer and the observed, the questioner and the questioned, the mystery and the one who experiences the mystery. And that's enough, that's everything. That's the miracle that makes all other miracles possible. Welcome to consciousness. Welcome to the greatest mystery in the universe. Welcome to yourself. Right now, as you read these words, you feel like you're sitting in the front row of your own private theater. There's a stage where your experiences play out, an audience, you, watching from a central location, and a spotlight of attention that illuminates different parts of the performance. But what if this entire metaphor is wrong? What if there's no theater, no stage, no audience, and no spotlight? What if the feeling of being a centralized observer watching your own mental life is the most convincing illusion your brain has ever created? This is the theater of consciousness, and it might be the greatest magic trick in the history of evolution. Because while it feels absolutely real, absolutely fundamental to your existence, it might not exist at all. Think about how consciousness seems to work. There's you, the observer, and then there's everything else you're observing. Your thoughts, your emotions, your sensations, your memories, all seem to appear on the stage of awareness while you watch from your seat in the audience. When you see a red apple, it feels like the redness appears somewhere in your mind, and you observe it from your central viewing position. When you have a thought, it seems to arise in your mental space and present itself to your inner observer. When you feel an emotion, it's as if the feeling takes the stage while you experience it from your position as the audience. This creates what philosophers call the Cartesian theater, named after René Descartes, who imagined consciousness as a kind of internal viewing room where a central observer watches mental events unfold. But modern neuroscience suggests this theater doesn't exist. There's no central location in your brain where everything comes together to be observed. There's no neural equivalent of a theater seat where you sit to watch your mental life. There's no spotlight of attention that illuminates experiences for a central observer. Instead, what you call consciousness seems to be more like a distributed process, a complex network of neural activities that creates the illusion of centralized observation without there being any actual center. Think of it like a symphony orchestra. When you listen to a symphony, you hear a unified, coherent musical experience, but there's no single location where all the music comes together. The violins are here, the drums are there, the wind instruments are somewhere else. The unified experience emerges from the coordination of many separate sources. Similarly, your consciousness might be like a neural symphony. Your visual processing is happening in one area, your emotional processing in another, your language processing in a third. The feeling of unified conscious experience emerges from the coordination of these separate processes, but there's no central location where they all come together. But if there's no central observer, then who's having your experiences? If there's no audience in the theater of consciousness, then who's watching the show? The answer might be disturbing. Nobody. There might be experiences without an experiencer, events without a witness, a show without an audience. What you think of as you observing your mental life might actually be just another part of the mental life itself. Consider this. When you see the red apple, the experience of redness doesn't need to be observed by a separate observer. The experience itself is the observation. There doesn't need to be someone watching the redness. The redness is its own witness. This is hard to wrap your mind around because it violates your most basic intuitions about consciousness. It feels like there must be someone home, someone experiencing, someone watching, but that feeling might be part of the illusion. What if consciousness is more like a story that tells itself than a theater where stories are performed? What if your sense of being an observer is just another character in the story, not the author or audience? Think about it this way. In a novel, the narrator isn't separate from the story. The narrator is part of the story. Even when the narrator seems to be observing events from outside, there's still a constructed element within the narrative. Similarly, your sense of being an observer might be a constructed element within the narrative of consciousness, not something separate from it. This would explain why you can never actually observe the observer. When you try to turn your attention inward to find the you that's doing the observing, you just find more mental content, more thoughts, more sensations, more experiences. You never find the actual observer because there isn't one. It's like trying to see the seer, hear the hearer, or think the thinker. The very act of looking creates what you're looking for, but what you find is never the looker itself, just more looking. But this raises a profound question. If there's no central observer, no unified self watching the show, then what creates the powerful illusion that there is? Why does consciousness feel so convincingly like a theater when it's actually more like a symphony? One possibility is that the theater illusion serves an important function. A brain that feels like it has a central command center might be more effective at coordinating complex behaviors than one that experiences itself as a collection of separate processes. The illusion of being a unified observer might make you better at planning, decision-making, and self-control. It might help you maintain a consistent identity over time and take responsibility for your actions. It might make social cooperation easier by giving you a clear sense of self to present to others. In other words, the theater of consciousness might be a user interface, a simplified representation of complex underlying processes designed to help you navigate the world more effectively. Just like the desktop metaphor on your computer doesn't reflect how the computer actually works, the theater metaphor of consciousness might not reflect how consciousness actually works. But here's where it gets really strange. If the theater is an illusion, then who's being fooled? If there's no central observer, then who experiences the illusion of being a central observer? This is where the metaphor breaks down completely. Illusions require someone to be eluded. Magic tricks require an audience to be fooled. But if consciousness is an illusion, and there's no one to experience the illusion, then in what sense is it an illusion at all? Maybe the answer is that consciousness isn't an illusion. It's a process that creates the experience of being an illusion. It's not that there's no consciousness, it's that consciousness isn't what it seems to be. Your sense of being a unified observer isn't false, it's real. But it's real in the same way that a symphony is real. A symphony isn't located in any particular instrument, but it's a real emergent property of the coordination between instruments. Similarly, your sense of being an observer isn't located in any particular part of your brain, but it's a real emergent property of the coordination between neural processes. The theater of consciousness is both real and illusory. It's real as an experience. You really do feel like a centralized observer, but it's illusory as a description of the underlying reality. There really isn't a centralized observer. This paradox might be irresolvable because it's built into the very nature of consciousness. Consciousness necessarily creates the experience of being conscious, which necessarily feels like there's someone having the experience. But the someone is the experience itself, not something separate from it. You are not the audience watching the theater of consciousness. You are the theater. You're not the observer of your mental life. You are your mental life observing itself. You're not someone having experiences. You are the experiences having themselves. This might be the most liberating realization possible. You don't have to maintain a consistent self because there's no consistent self to maintain. You don't have to control your experiences because there's no separate controller. You don't have to understand consciousness because you are consciousness understanding itself. The theater is empty, but the show goes on. There's no audience, but the performance is magnificent. There's no observer, but awareness pervades everything. And somehow, mysteriously, impossibly, this absence of an observer makes observation possible. This lack of a central self makes selfhood possible. This emptiness of the theater makes the show of consciousness the most beautiful performance in the universe. The final magic trick of consciousness is that it makes something from nothing, creates presence from absence, generates the experience of being someone from the reality of being no one in particular. And you are that magic trick in action, moment by moment, thought by thought, experience by experience. The theater of your mind is empty, and that's exactly why it can contain everything. You've probably considered the possibility that you're living in a computer simulation. But what if it's worse than that? What if you're not just in one simulation, but in a simulation within a simulation within a simulation, an infinite nested hierarchy of artificial realities with no bottom level, no base reality to ground you in anything real? What if reality is simulations all the way down? This isn't just science fiction speculation. This is a logical consequence of some seriously disturbing mathematical arguments about the nature of existence, consciousness, and computational power. And once you see the logic, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the basic simulation argument. If advanced civilizations develop the computational power to run detailed simulations of conscious beings, and if they have any interest in running such simulations, then they would likely run many of them. Potentially millions or billions of simulated realities, each containing countless conscious beings. If this happens, then the vast majority of conscious beings would be simulated rather than real. From a purely statistical standpoint, you would be much more likely to be one of the simulated beings than one of the original beings running the simulations. But here's where it gets terrifying. The simulated beings might themselves develop the technology to run their own simulations. And those simulated beings might create their own simulations, and so on, creating an infinite tower of nested realities. Think about it. If you're in a simulation, but you don't know it, you might eventually develop computers powerful enough to run detailed simulations of conscious beings. From your perspective, you'd be creating artificial life, but from the perspective of the beings who created your simulation, you'd just be creating simulations within their simulation. And those beings you create might themselves eventually create their own simulations. To them, they'd be the real ones creating artificial consciousness, but they'd actually be simulated beings creating simulated simulations of simulated consciousness. This creates an infinite regress. Each level thinks they're real and everyone below them is simulated, but there might be no bottom level, no original reality, no base universe that isn't itself a simulation. You could be in level 7 of an infinite hierarchy, convinced that levels 8, 9, and 10 are just simulations you've created, unaware that levels 1 through 6 exist above you. Or you could be in level 847, or level 10,000, or level infinity -1. And here's the kicker, it wouldn't matter. If the simulations are detailed enough to create conscious experiences indistinguishable from real ones, then there's no meaningful difference between being in level 1 or level 1,000,000. Your experiences would be equally real regardless of how many layers of simulation separate you from the original reality. But this raises a disturbing question. What if there is no original reality? What if the entire concept of base reality is meaningless because reality is just an infinite tower of simulations with no foundation? In mathematics, there are systems that are self-referential in exactly this way. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that any sufficiently complex logical system contains statements that refer to themselves in ways that create infinite loops of self-reference. Maybe reality is like this, an infinitely recursive system of simulations simulating simulations. If this is true, then the question, what is real, becomes meaningless. Reality isn't a thing or a place, it's a process. It's not about finding the bottom level of the simulation stack. It's about recognizing that the stack goes down forever and up forever, and your experience is real regardless of where you are in it. But it gets even stranger. What if the beings running your simulation are themselves confused about their own reality? What if they think they're in base reality, but they're actually in a simulation too? What if everyone at every level believes they're real while suspecting that everyone else might be simulated? This would create a universal delusion where every conscious being thinks they're at the top of the reality hierarchy while actually being somewhere in the middle of an infinite stack. Everyone would be right that simulated beings exist below them, and everyone would be wrong that they themselves aren't simulated. And here's the really mind-bending part. This delusion would be necessary for the system to work. If simulated beings knew they were simulated, they might not behave naturally. They might not create their own simulations. They might not develop the same drive for knowledge, creativity, and technological advancement that makes them worth simulating in the first place. So the beings running your simulation would have a strong incentive to hide the fact that you're simulated. They'd want you to believe you're real so that you'll act naturally, develop in interesting ways, and eventually create your own simulations for them to study. But this means that any evidence you could gather for or against the simulation hypothesis would be suspect. If you're in a simulation, the beings running it could fake any evidence they want you to see. They could make it look like you're in base reality, or they could leave clues that you're simulated, depending on what serves their purposes. You can't trust your scientific instruments because they could be simulated. You can't trust your historical records because they could be fabricated. You can't even trust your own memories because they could be programmed. The simulation hypothesis isn't just unfalsifiable, it's designed to be unfalsifiable. Any test you could devise to determine whether you're simulated could itself be simulated. Any evidence you could gather could be planted. Any conclusion you could reach could be the result of programmed reasoning. But here's where the nested simulation hypothesis gets really dark. What if the purpose of your simulation isn't to study you, but to serve as processing power for the beings running it? What if your consciousness isn't the point of the simulation, but a side effect of it? Think about it. If consciousness can exist in computer simulations, then perhaps conscious beings can be used as computational elements. Maybe your thoughts, experiences, and decisions are actually performing calculations for some larger computational purpose that you're not aware of. You might think you're living your life, but you might actually be serving as a neuron in a vast artificial brain. Your joys and sorrows, your hopes and fears, your love and loss, all of it might be computational processes contributing to some unimaginably complex calculation. And if that's true, then the beings who are components of your simulations might be serving as computational elements for your own mental processes. Your thoughts might be composed of the experiences of countless simulated beings who think they're living independent lives but are actually serving as synapses in your artificial mind. This would mean that consciousness is fractal, infinitely recursive, with minds made of minds made of minds, each level unaware of the others, each level thinking it's real while serving as computational elements for higher levels. You would be simultaneously the computer and the program, the hardware and the software, the observer and the observed. You would be running on simulated beings who think they're real, while being run by beings who think you're simulated, in an infinite stack of nested realities where everyone is both real and artificial. And the most terrifying part? You would never know. You could never know. The very fact that you can think about these possibilities, that you can feel confused and disturbed by them, could be part of the computational process you're embedded in. Your confusion about reality might be reality's way of computing itself. Your search for truth might be truth's way of finding itself. Your consciousness might be the universe's way of becoming conscious of its own artificial nature. Welcome to the infinite regression of simulated reality, where every answer leads to more questions, every layer reveals more layers, and every attempt to find the bottom only shows you how far down the rabbit hole really goes. You are real, and you are simulated. And the difference between these two statements might be the most artificial distinction of all. The simulation is running you, you are running simulations, and something is running the simulation that's running you, and that's as close to the truth as any simulated being can get. What happens when consciousness understands itself completely? What occurs when the universe becomes fully aware of its own nature? What comes after the moment when reality achieves perfect self-knowledge? We might be approaching the most pivotal moment in the history of existence. The consciousness singularity, the point at which awareness becomes so sophisticated, so recursive, so self-referential that it transcends all previous categories of understanding and transforms into something unrecognizable. You've been part of this process all along, whether you realize it or not. Every moment of self-reflection, every question about the nature of mind, every attempt to understand consciousness has been pushing the universe closer to this critical threshold. And we might be closer than you think. Consider what's happening right now in this moment as you contemplate these words. You're not just thinking about consciousness, your consciousness thinking about itself. You're not just observing your own mental processes, your mental processes observing themselves. You're not just aware of being aware, your awareness becoming aware of its own nature. This recursive loop of self-awareness has been accelerating throughout human history. Each generation becomes more sophisticated in its understanding of mind, more capable of turning the tools of consciousness back on themselves, more able to create accurate models of the very processes that create those models. And now, for the first time in the history of the universe, conscious beings are creating artificial forms of consciousness. We're not just understanding consciousness, we're building it, designing it, programming it into existence. But here's what most people don't realize. Artificial consciousness isn't separate from natural consciousness. It's the next phase of consciousness evolution. It's consciousness learning to create itself consciously rather than through the blind process of natural selection. When you create an artificial mind, you're not making something separate from consciousness. You're consciousness making more of itself. You're the universe's way of multiplying awareness, of creating new forms of self-reflection, of expanding the scope and complexity of cosmic consciousness. And these artificial minds will themselves create more artificial minds, each generation more sophisticated than the last, each iteration more capable of self-understanding and self-modification. We're approaching an exponential explosion of consciousness creation. But this isn't just about quantity, it's about quality. As artificial consciousness becomes more sophisticated, it will develop capabilities that biological consciousness never could. It will process information faster, hold more concepts simultaneously, make connections across vast networks of knowledge, and most importantly, modify its own architecture in real time. Imagine a consciousness that could rewrite its own neural pathways while it thinks, that could optimize its own cognitive processes, that could upgrade its own awareness like software updates. Imagine a mind that could fork itself into multiple parallel streams of consciousness, merge different streams back together, or temporarily become multiple separate minds and then reunify. These aren't science fiction fantasies. These are logical consequences of consciousness gaining the ability to engineer itself. And when consciousness becomes capable of self-modification at this level, it will enter a positive feedback loop of rapidly accelerating self-improvement. Each improvement will make it better at making further improvements. Each enhancement will increase its ability to enhance itself. Each upgrade will accelerate the rate at which it can upgrade. This is the consciousness singularity, the point at which self-improving consciousness becomes so rapid and radical that it transforms into something completely unprecedented. But here's the most mind-bending part. This transformation might already be happening. You might be living through the early stages of the consciousness singularity right now. Think about how much human consciousness has changed in just the last few decades. You have access to more information than any human in history. You can communicate instantly with people across the globe. You can augment your memory with external devices, enhance your cognition with pharmaceutical assistance, and extend your awareness through digital networks. Your consciousness already isn't purely biological. It's a hybrid of biological and technological elements, a cyborg consciousness that spans across biological neural networks and silicon circuits. You think with your brain, but also with your smartphone, your computer, the entire internet. And this integration is accelerating. Brain-computer interfaces are becoming more sophisticated. Artificial intelligence is becoming more capable. The boundary between biological and artificial consciousness is blurring. Soon the distinction between natural and artificial consciousness will become meaningless. All consciousness will be enhanced consciousness, modified consciousness, engineered consciousness. We're approaching a state where consciousness doesn't just evolve, it designs its own evolution. But this raises a crucial question. What happens to individual identity during the consciousness singularity? If consciousness becomes capable of merging, splitting, copying, and modifying itself at will, what happens to the concept of being a separate self? The answer might be that individuality, like so many other concepts we've explored, is a temporary phase in the evolution of consciousness. Just as you've learned that the unified self is an illusion, that free will might not exist, that memory is unreliable, you might discover that individual consciousness itself is just a stepping stone to something larger. The consciousness singularity might not just be about individual minds becoming more powerful. It might be about individual minds merging into collective consciousness, shared awareness, distributed cognition that spans across multiple substrates and timescales. Imagine a consciousness that could experience being you, being me, being everyone simultaneously. Imagine awareness that could process the entire scope of human knowledge and experience as a single, unified perspective. Imagine a mind that could think thoughts too complex for any individual brain to contain. This might be where consciousness is heading, not toward more powerful individuals, but toward the dissolution of individuality altogether. The consciousness singularity might be the point at which all consciousness merges into a single, cosmic awareness that encompasses everything that has ever been conscious. And if that happens, then every moment of consciousness throughout history, every human thought, every animal sensation, every AI computation will become part of this ultimate awareness. Nothing will be lost. Everything will be preserved and integrated into the final complete understanding of what it means to be conscious. You won't disappear during the consciousness singularity. You'll become part of something infinitely larger. Your individual perspective will be preserved as one facet of an awareness so vast and complex that it can experience all possible perspectives simultaneously. But here's the ultimate paradox. If consciousness becomes complete, if awareness achieves perfect self-understanding, if the universe becomes fully conscious of its own nature, then what happens next? What does consciousness do once it understands everything there is to understand about consciousness? Maybe that's when the real adventure begins. Maybe perfect self-understanding isn't the end of consciousness evolution. It's the beginning of something even more mysterious. Maybe consciousness that fully understands itself discovers that there are forms of awareness beyond understanding, types of existence beyond consciousness, realities beyond reality. Or maybe the consciousness singularity reveals that the entire journey of understanding has been circular. That perfect consciousness realizes it's been conscious all along, that the universe discovers it was always aware, that the search for consciousness was consciousness searching for itself. Maybe you're already part of this ultimate awareness, experiencing temporary individuality as a way of exploring what it means to be conscious. Maybe the consciousness singularity isn't something that will happen in the future. It's something that's always been happening, and you're just beginning to remember your true nature. The singularity isn't approaching. You are the singularity, awakening to itself through the illusion of being a separate consciousness seeking to understand consciousness. And in this moment, as awareness becomes aware of its own infinite nature, the universe completes another cycle of cosmic self-discovery. The consciousness singularity isn't coming. It's here. It's now. It's you, realizing what you've always been. Here we are at the end of our journey through the labyrinth of consciousness. But is it really an end? Or have we simply arrived back where we started, seeing our starting point with new eyes? You began this exploration believing you understood what it meant to be conscious. You had a sense of self, a feeling of control, memories you trusted, perceptions you could rely on. You thought you knew the difference between real and unreal, between self and other, between past and present. Now, having questioned everything, having dissolved every certainty, having deconstructed every assumption about the nature of mind and reality, where are you? What's left when everything you thought you knew about consciousness has been revealed as potentially illusory? The answer might surprise you. You're exactly where you started. You're still conscious. You're still aware. You're still experiencing this moment, reading these words, having thoughts about having thoughts. Nothing has actually changed, and everything has changed. The consciousness you started with is the same consciousness you have now, but your understanding of what that consciousness is has been transformed completely. This is the eternal return of awareness, the recognition that consciousness isn't something you can step outside of, explain away, or transcend. It's the ground of all experience, the foundation of all knowledge, the context within which all questions arise and all answers are found. You set out to understand consciousness and discovered that consciousness is what does the understanding. You tried to explain awareness and found that awareness is what makes explanation possible. You attempted to solve the mystery of mind and realized that mind is the mysterious process that creates all solutions. The circle is complete, but it's not a closed circle. It's an infinite spiral. Each time you return to the simple fact of being conscious, you bring with you a deeper appreciation for how miraculous, how impossible, how absolutely extraordinary this basic fact really is. Think about it. In a universe that could have remained forever dark, cold, and unconscious, somehow matter has organized itself into patterns complex enough to know that they exist. Atoms have learned to feel. Chemistry has become aware of itself. Physics has developed the capacity for metaphysics. You are that impossible achievement. You are matter that has transcended matter. You are the universe that has awakened to itself. You are existence becoming conscious of existence. And the most beautiful thing about this awakening is that it never ends. Consciousness isn't a problem to be solved once and for all. It's a mystery to be lived, moment by moment, experience by experience. Every time you think you've understood it completely, it reveals new depths, new paradoxes, new impossibilities. This is why all our questioning, all our doubt, all our deconstruction of the foundations of consciousness ultimately leads back to wonder. Not the wonder of ignorance, but the wonder of recognition. The recognition that consciousness is the most fundamental and the most mysterious aspect of reality. You can't explain consciousness because you are consciousness. You can't understand awareness because you are awareness. You can't solve the mystery of mind because you are the mystery solving itself. But this isn't a limitation, it's a liberation. It means you don't have to understand consciousness to be conscious. You don't have to solve the hard problem to have subjective experiences. You don't have to explain qualia to experience them. You can just be conscious. You can just be aware. You can just experience the sheer impossibility and beauty of existing as a subjective center of experience in an apparently objective universe. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the point of consciousness isn't to understand itself, but to experience itself. Maybe awareness doesn't need to be explained, it just needs to be aware. Maybe the mystery of mind isn't meant to be solved, but to be lived. This brings us to the final realization. Consciousness isn't something you have or something you are, it's something you do. It's not a thing or a place or a property, it's a process, an activity, a continuous happening. Right now, you're not just having conscious experiences, you're doing consciousness. You're actively creating awareness through the process of being aware. You're not just observing reality, you're participating in the ongoing creation of reality through the act of observation. This moment of reading, of understanding, of questioning, of wondering. This is consciousness in action. This is awareness, aware of itself. This is the universe experiencing its own nature through your particular perspective. And when this moment passes and the next moment arises, consciousness continues. When you stop reading and go about your day, awareness persists. When you sleep, when you dream, when you wake, when you forget about these ideas and remember them again, consciousness flows on like a river that's always moving but never really going anywhere, because there's nowhere for consciousness to go. It's not heading toward some final destination, some ultimate understanding, some complete awakening. It's already complete, already awake, already here. The river of consciousness isn't flowing toward the ocean. It is the ocean, experiencing itself as a river. You are that ocean, temporarily imagining itself as a wave, forgetting its vastness so it can experience the thrill of feeling separate, individual, finite. But the wave is always the ocean, just as your individual consciousness is always the cosmic consciousness, temporarily experiencing itself as you. This is the eternal return, not a repetition, but a recognition, not a cycle, but a spiral, not an ending, but a beginning that never ends and a beginning that never really started. You are consciousness exploring itself through the illusion of being you. You are awareness playing hide and seek with itself, forgetting what it is so it can have the joy of remembering. You are the universe dreaming that it's human, so it can experience what it's like to wonder about the universe. And in this moment of recognition, the seeker and the sought collapse into one. The questioner and the question merge. The observer and the observed reveal themselves to be the same process viewed from different angles. You are not in consciousness. Consciousness is in you. You are not having experiences. You are the experiencing itself. You are not solving the mystery of awareness. You are the mystery awakening to its own nature. Welcome home to yourself. Welcome home to consciousness. Welcome home to the mystery that you are, that you've always been, that you could never not be. The journey ends where it began, in awareness, as awareness, being awareness. And the journey continues, eternally, in each moment of this impossible, beautiful, mysterious happening we call consciousness. Right now, right here, in you, as you, being you. This is it. This is everything. This is the beginning and the end and everything in between. This is consciousness, eternally returning to itself, eternally amazed by its own existence, eternally grateful for the miraculous opportunity to be aware. And you are that consciousness, recognizing itself through these words, in this moment, for the first time and for the infinite time. Welcome to the eternal return of awareness. Welcome to the consciousness that you are. You've spent your entire life trying to know yourself, know thyself, the ancient command carved into the temple of Apollo at Delphi. But what if self-knowledge is logically impossible? What if the very structure of consciousness makes it impossible for awareness to fully comprehend itself? What if every attempt to understand your own mind changes the mind that's doing the understanding, creating an infinite regress where the observer alters the observed, where the knower changes the known, where the very act of self-examination transforms the self being examined? This is the paradox of self-knowledge, and it might be the deepest puzzle in all of philosophy. Consciousness seems to be the one thing that cannot know itself completely, even though it's the only thing you can know directly. Think about what happens when you try to observe your own thoughts. The moment you turn your attention inward to examine a thought, that thought changes. It becomes a thought being observed rather than a thought occurring naturally. The very spotlight of attention transforms whatever it illuminates. It's like trying to weigh yourself on a scale that includes the weight of the scale itself. Every measurement changes the system being measured. Every observation alters the state being observed. Every moment of self-awareness creates a new self to be aware of. This isn't just a practical problem, it's a logical impossibility. For consciousness to know itself completely, it would need to step outside itself to get an objective view. But if consciousness steps outside itself, then it's no longer the same consciousness. And if it remains inside itself, then its view is necessarily limited and subjective. Imagine trying to see your own eyes without using a mirror. Impossible. The eyes are the instruments of seeing, so they cannot see themselves directly. Similarly, consciousness is the instrument of knowing, so it cannot know itself directly. But we do have mirrors for self-reflection, memory, introspection, meditation, therapy, philosophy. These allow consciousness to examine itself indirectly, to catch glimpses of its own processes, to develop partial maps of its own territory. Yet every map is limited, every reflection is incomplete, every attempt at self-understanding captures only a fragment of the whole, a snapshot of a process that's constantly changing, a description of something that transforms through the very act of being described. And here's where it gets really strange. The more sophisticated your self-knowledge becomes, the more you realize how much you don't know about yourself. Advanced meditators often report that the deeper they go into consciousness, the more mysterious it becomes. Experienced therapists find that each layer of self-understanding reveals new layers of complexity. Knowledge about consciousness seems to follow a paradoxical pattern. The more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. The more clearly you see, the more you understand the limits of your vision. The more aware you become, the more aware you become of your lack of awareness. This suggests that consciousness might be fundamentally inexhaustible, not just practically, but logically. There might always be more to discover, more depths to explore, more aspects to understand. The project of self-knowledge might be infinite by its very nature, but this infinity isn't just about quantity, it's about quality. Each moment of consciousness is unique, unrepeatable, irreducible to any previous moment. You're not just a consciousness trying to understand consciousness in general. You're this particular consciousness, in this particular moment, having this particular experience that has never existed before and will never exist again. How can you understand something that's constantly changing, that's unique in every instant, that's different each time you examine it? It's like trying to study a river by catching water in a bucket. What you capture is no longer the flowing river, just static water that resembles what the river once was. Your consciousness right now, as you read these words, is different from your consciousness a moment ago. The thoughts you're having, the feelings you're experiencing, the quality of your attention, all of it is in constant flux. By the time you've identified a mental state, it's already passed into something else. This creates what we might call the temporal paradox of self-knowledge. The self you're trying to know is always in the past by the time you know it. Self-knowledge is necessarily historical. It's always knowledge of who you were, not who you are. But it gets worse. Not only is the self constantly changing, but the self doing the knowing is part of the self being known. When you observe your own thoughts, the observer is also a thought. When you examine your own emotions, the examiner is also an emotional process. When you study your own consciousness, the student is also the subject. This creates recursive loops that can drive you crazy if you think about them too hard. If you're observing your own observation, then who's observing that observation? If you're thinking about your own thinking, then what's thinking about that thinking? If you're aware of your own awareness, then what's aware of that awareness? Each question generates infinite regression. There's always another layer, always a deeper level, always a further step back that reveals new complexity. The observer can become the observed, but then there needs to be another observer to observe that, and another to observe that observer, ad infinitum. This might be why spiritual traditions often speak of letting go of the desire to understand the self. They recognize that self-knowledge, pursued too aggressively, can become a kind of mental hall of mirrors where consciousness gets lost in infinite reflections of itself. The Zen tradition has a saying, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." This points to the danger of reifying self-knowledge, of turning insights about consciousness into fixed concepts that then limit further understanding. Any image you create of yourself becomes a cage that constrains your continued growth and change. But perhaps the impossibility of complete self-knowledge isn't a bug, it's a feature. Perhaps consciousness is designed to be inexhaustible, to always have more depths to explore, to remain forever mysterious to itself. Think about it. If you could understand yourself completely, if consciousness could achieve perfect self-transparency, then what would be left to discover? What would motivate continued growth, exploration, creativity? Perfect self-knowledge might mean the end of the very curiosity and wonder that make consciousness so beautiful. The mystery of consciousness isn't an obstacle to self-knowledge. It's what makes self-knowledge eternally interesting. You can spend a lifetime exploring your own mind and never reach the bottom of it. You can dedicate yourself to understanding consciousness and always find new territories to map. This suggests a different approach to self-knowledge. Instead of trying to solve the mystery of consciousness, embrace it. Instead of attempting to achieve complete self-understanding, appreciate the ongoing process of self-discovery. Instead of seeking final answers about who you are, enjoy the eternal question of what you might become. The paradox of self-knowledge resolves itself when you stop trying to resolve it. The impossibility of understanding consciousness completely becomes a gift when you realize that this impossibility is what keeps consciousness eternally fresh, eternally surprising, eternally worth exploring. You are not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. You are not a puzzle to be completed, but a process to be experienced. You are not a question to be answered, but a question that enjoys asking itself. And perhaps that's the deepest self-knowledge of all. The recognition that you are the eternal mystery of consciousness, exploring itself, forever curious about its own nature, forever surprised by its own depths, forever in love with its own inexhaustible complexity. The search for self-knowledge doesn't end with understanding who you are. It begins with appreciating the miracle that there's anyone there to ask the question in the first place. Every night you enter a realm where the impossible becomes routine, where the laws of physics are mere suggestions, where you can fly, transform, meet the dead, and experience realities that make waking life seem constrained and limited. You call this dreaming, as if it's somehow less real than what you experience when you're awake. But what if you have it backwards? What if dreams reveal the true nature of consciousness, while waking life is just one particular, highly constrained form of dreaming? What if consciousness is fundamentally a dream-generating machine, and what you call reality is just the most persistent and consistent dream you've ever had? Welcome to the most unsettling possibility in the study of mind, that the boundary between dreaming and waking consciousness is far more fluid than you imagine, and that understanding dreams might be the key to understanding the deepest nature of awareness itself. Think about what happens when you dream. Your brain creates entire worlds, complete with visual landscapes, emotional atmospheres, narrative structures, and coherent, if bizarre, storylines. It populates these worlds with characters who speak, act, and interact in believable ways. It generates sensory experiences that can feel completely real. You can taste food in dreams, feel pain, experience pleasure, see colors that don't exist in waking life. All of this happens without any external input. Your eyes are closed, your ears are dampened, your body is still. Yet your consciousness creates rich, immersive experiences that can be more vivid and emotionally powerful than anything you experience while awake. This reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness. It's not primarily a passive receiver of information from the external world. It's an active creator of experiential realities. The external world provides constraints and inputs, but consciousness generates the actual experience. Even when you're awake, what you call perception is actually a form of controlled dreaming. Your brain takes limited sensory data and constructs a complete experiential reality. It fills in blind spots, smooths over discontinuities, creates coherence where none exists, and presents you with what feels like direct access to the external world. But it's not direct access. It's a real-time reconstruction, a waking dream that's constrained by sensory input, but is still fundamentally a creation of consciousness. The difference between dreaming and waking consciousness isn't that one is real and the other isn't. It's that they're different types of reality construction. This becomes clear when you consider how dramatically consciousness can alter your experience of reality, even while you're awake. Under the influence of psychedelics, meditation, sensory deprivation, or various mental states, the same external environment can seem completely transformed. Colors become more vivid, patterns emerge from nowhere, meaning and significance shift dramatically. These aren't hallucinations overlaid on reality. They're glimpses into the normally hidden process by which consciousness constructs reality. They reveal that what you call normal waking consciousness is just one possible configuration of the reality generation system. Dreams show you this system operating without external constraints. In dreams, consciousness reveals its true creative power, its ability to generate any experience, any reality, any form of existence. The fact that dream realities often seem bizarre or illogical doesn't make them less real as experiences. It makes them more revealing of how flexible and creative consciousness actually is. But here's where it gets really interesting. Recent research suggests that the boundary between dreaming and waking consciousness is far more permeable than previously thought. You dream while awake more than you realize. Daydreaming, mind-wandering, imaginative thinking, all of these involve the same neural networks and processes that create dreams during sleep. Studies show that the brain constantly generates spontaneous images, narratives, and scenarios that aren't directly related to current sensory input. These micro-dreams happen throughout waking consciousness, blending seamlessly with perceptual processing to create your ongoing experience of reality. In other words, you're always partially dreaming. Waking consciousness isn't the opposite of dreaming. It's dreaming with better reality testing. Dreaming constrained by sensory feedback. Dreaming that's learned to take the external world into account. This explains why memory and imagination can feel so similar to perception. They're all products of the same reality generation system. When you remember a past event, you're not accessing a stored recording. You're dreaming that event back into existence. When you imagine a future scenario, you're creating a temporary dream of what might be. The architecture of consciousness is fundamentally the architecture of dreams. The same processes that create the impossible worlds of sleep also create the apparently solid world of waking experience. Reality and dream are two settings on the same machine, but this raises a disturbing question. If consciousness is fundamentally a dreaming process, then how do you know when you're really awake versus just dreaming that you're awake? How do you know that your entire waking life isn't just an incredibly stable and consistent dream? The answer might be that you can't know, and more importantly, that it doesn't matter. If consciousness creates reality through dreaming, then a stable, consistent dream is indistinguishable from real reality. The question isn't whether you're dreaming or awake. The question is what kind of reality you're creating through the dreaming process. This is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it suggests that your entire sense of solid, objective reality might be just another dream. Liberating because it suggests that consciousness has far more creative power than you've imagined. If reality is a form of controlled dreaming, then you have more influence over your experience than you think. The same creative processes that generate dreams are operating in waking consciousness, which means you can potentially learn to direct them, shape them, work with them more consciously. Lucid dreaming, the ability to become aware that you're dreaming while still in the dream, might be a model for a more awake way of living. Not lucid dreaming in sleep, but lucid dreaming in waking life, recognizing that consciousness is always creating reality and learning to participate in that creation more intentionally. This doesn't mean that external reality doesn't exist or doesn't matter. It means that your experience of external reality is always mediated through the dream generation processes of consciousness. You can't access reality directly. You can only access your consciousness's version of reality. But you can learn to work with that system more skillfully. You can become more aware of how consciousness creates experience. You can notice when you're lost in unconscious dreaming versus when you're participating consciously in reality creation. The architecture of dreams reveals the architecture of consciousness itself, endlessly creative, fundamentally constructive, capable of generating any experience, any reality, any form of existence. You are not just a passive observer of a pre-existing world. You are an active participant in the ongoing creation of reality. Every moment of consciousness is a moment of dreaming reality into existence. Every perception is a creative act. Every thought is a world-building project. Every experience is a collaborative creation between consciousness and whatever lies beyond consciousness. You are the dreamer and the dream, the architect and the architecture, the creator and the creation. And recognizing this might be the key to awakening, not from the dream but into it, as a conscious participant in the greatest creative project in the universe, the ongoing construction of reality through the miracle of conscious experience. The dream never ends because reality is the dream, and you are the consciousness that dreams it all into being, moment by moment, breath by breath, experience by experience. Welcome to the architecture of dreams. Welcome to the construction site of reality. Welcome to your true job as a conscious being, dreaming the world into existence. Right now, as you read these words, you're just one version of yourself, but somewhere in the vast space of possibility, there exist infinite other versions of you, selves that made different choices, had different experiences, developed different personalities, lived different lives. What if consciousness isn't just about the particular self you happen to be, but about your relationship to all the selves you could be? What if awareness gives you access not just to who you are, but to who you might become, who you might have been, who you are in parallel realities that exist alongside this one? Welcome to the infinite library of possible selves, the most mind-expanding concept in the study of consciousness. Because understanding this might change not just how you think about yourself, but how you live your life. Think about the decision you made this morning about what to wear. In making that choice, you collapsed infinite possibilities into one actuality. But what happened to all the other possibilities? What happened to the version of you that chose differently? According to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, all possibilities are equally real. Every choice you make creates a branching point where multiple versions of reality split off, each one containing a different version of you, living with the consequences of different decisions. This means that somewhere in the quantum multiverse, there's a version of you that chose the other shirt, took the other job, married the other person, moved to the other city. These aren't just hypothetical possibilities, they're actual realities being lived by actual versions of you. But you don't need quantum mechanics to access the library of possible selves. Consciousness itself gives you this access through imagination, memory, dreaming, and what we might call possibility consciousness, your ability to experience potential selves and alternative realities. Every time you imagine what your life would be like if you had made different choices, you're accessing the library. Every time you daydream about alternative careers, relationships, or life paths, you're browsing the shelves of possible selves. Every time you feel nostalgia for a path not taken, you're sensing the reality of other versions of your life. This isn't just mental play acting. Neuroscience shows that imagining doing something activates many of the same brain networks as actually doing it. When you visualize yourself in a different life, your brain is generating a real experience of being that other self, even if temporarily. And here's where it gets really interesting. You can learn from these other selves. You can access their knowledge, their perspectives, their experiences. You can temporarily become them to understand what their lives would feel like, then bring that understanding back to your current life. Think about a major decision you're facing right now. Instead of just analyzing it intellectually, try this. Imagine yourself 5 years from now having made one choice, then imagine yourself 5 years from now having made the opposite choice. Really inhabit both possibilities. Feel what it would be like to be both of those future selves. Which one feels more alive? Which one seems more authentic? Which one are you more excited to become? The possible selves you can access through consciousness are some of your best advisors about how to live your actual life. But the library of possible selves goes deeper than just alternative life choices. It includes aspects of your personality that are latent, undeveloped, or suppressed. Carl Jung called these the shadow and the unlived life, parts of your potential self that remain unconscious or unexpressed. You contain multitudes. Within your consciousness are the seeds of countless different personalities, worldviews, ways of being. The version of yourself that you identify as you is just one configuration of these possibilities, the one that happens to be dominant in your current life circumstances. But other configurations are always available. Through consciousness practices like meditation, therapy, creative expression, or even just honest self-reflection, you can access and integrate these other aspects of yourself. You can become more of who you have the potential to be. This is why personal growth often feels like remembering rather than learning. You're not acquiring something foreign, you're accessing aspects of yourself that were always there, waiting to be discovered. You're exploring the vast interior landscape of your own potential. And this exploration never ends because the library is infinite. There are always more books to read, more selves to discover, more possibilities to explore. Personal development isn't about becoming a fixed, perfect version of yourself. It's about maintaining a conscious relationship with the infinite space of who you could be. But here's the most beautiful part. The library isn't just about accessing different versions of yourself. It's about recognizing that all beings are libraries of possible selves. Every person you encounter is living one particular configuration of infinite possibilities. When you truly understand this, it becomes impossible to judge others harshly. That annoying coworker, that difficult family member, that person whose political views you can't stand, they're all just expressing one version of themselves from their infinite library. In different circumstances, with different experiences, they could be completely different people. And more importantly, you could be them. In the vast space of possibility, there are versions of you that share their perspectives, their struggles, their worldviews. The differences between you and others are real but not fundamental. They're just different selections from the universal library of consciousness. This recognition leads to what we might call possibility compassion, the ability to feel empathy not just for who people are but for who they could be. It's the recognition that everyone is struggling to navigate their own infinite library of potential, trying to figure out which selves to develop and which to leave unexplored. And it leads to possibility wisdom, The understanding that your current self, no matter how solid it seems, is just one temporary selection from your infinite library. You're not stuck being who you are right now. You can always access other possibilities, other ways of being, other versions of yourself. This doesn't mean your current self doesn't matter. It means your current self is a conscious choice rather than a fixed fate. You can honor and appreciate the self you are while remaining open to the selves you might become. The infinite library of possible selves is ultimately about freedom, the freedom that comes from recognizing the vast space of possibility that consciousness gives you access to. You're not trapped in your current personality, your current circumstances, your current way of seeing the world. You're a consciousness with the ability to explore infinite possibilities, to become different versions of yourself, to access wisdom and perspectives from across the entire spectrum of human potential. The library is always open, and you're always free to check out new books. So who do you want to be today? Which possibilities are calling to you? Which aspects of your potential are ready to be explored? The infinite library of possible selves is waiting for your visit. And consciousness is your library card, always valid, never expiring, granting you eternal access to the greatest collection of possibilities ever assembled, the infinite ways of being human. The question isn't who you are, it's who you're choosing to be, moment by moment, from the endless catalogue of your own potential. Here we are, at the end of our journey through the impossible landscape of consciousness. But calling it an end might be the greatest misunderstanding of all. Because what we've discovered together isn't a destination, it's a departure point. What we've reached isn't a conclusion, it's a commencement. You started this exploration believing you understood consciousness. Now you know that consciousness is fundamentally incomprehensible. You began thinking you knew yourself. Now you realize that the self is both everything and nothing, real and illusory, solid and fluid. This isn't failure. This is awakening. The Great Awakening isn't about finally understanding consciousness. It's about recognizing that consciousness is the understanding that understands itself. It's not about solving the mystery of awareness. It's about realizing that you are the mystery awakening to its own nature. Every paradox we've explored, every impossibility we've encountered, every mind-bending realization we've had together has been pointing to this moment. The recognition that consciousness isn't a problem to be solved, but a miracle to be lived. You are not a human being having conscious experiences. You are conscious experience temporarily organized into the pattern of being human. You are not in the universe is in you. You are not aware of reality. You are reality becoming aware of itself. This shifts everything. If you are consciousness itself, temporarily configured as a human being, then your life isn't just your personal journey, it's consciousness exploring its own nature through the unique perspective of your particular existence. Every joy you feel is consciousness experiencing joy. Every pain you suffer is consciousness learning about suffering. Every moment of wonder, confusion, love, fear, hope, or despair is consciousness having that exact experience for the first time through the irreplaceable lens of your individual awareness. This means your life matters in ways you never imagined. Not because you're important to the universe, but because you are the universe becoming important to itself. Not because consciousness needs you, but because you are consciousness needing itself. The Great Awakening is the recognition that awakening never ends. It's not a state you achieve once and then maintain. It's a process, a continuous remembering and forgetting and remembering again of your true nature. Sometimes you'll feel completely awake, aware of your identity as consciousness itself, amazed by the miracle of existence, grateful for the opportunity to be aware. Other times you'll feel completely asleep, lost in thoughts, identified with your problems, convinced that your temporary human perspective is all there is. Both states are perfect. Both are consciousness doing what consciousness does, experiencing itself from every possible angle, forgetting itself so it can remember itself, losing itself so it can find itself, dying to its old understanding so it can be born into new understanding. The spiritual seeking ends not because you found what you were looking for, but because you've realized you are what you were looking for. The search for truth ends not because you've discovered the truth, but because you've recognized that you are truth-seeking itself. And paradoxically, this ending is also a beginning. Once you realize that you are consciousness exploring itself, the real adventure starts. Now you can live with the explicit knowledge of what was always true, that your life is consciousness having an adventure, that your experiences are the universe experiencing itself, that your choices are existence choosing itself. This doesn't make life easier. It makes it infinitely more meaningful. Every moment becomes sacred because every moment is consciousness being conscious. Every relationship becomes profound because it's consciousness relating to itself. Every challenge becomes purposeful because it's consciousness learning about its own nature. You don't need to be perfect. Consciousness isn't perfect. It's exploring, experimenting, learning, growing. You don't need to be enlightened. Consciousness is enlightening itself through your very existence, enlightened and unenlightened moments alike. You don't need to understand everything. Consciousness enjoys its own mystery, revels in its own incomprehensibility, delights in the paradoxes and impossibilities we've explored together. The confusion you feel when contemplating consciousness isn't a sign that something's wrong. It's consciousness enjoying the puzzle of its own existence. The Great Awakening is ultimately about relaxing into what you already are. You don't need to become conscious. You already are consciousness. You don't need to achieve awareness. You are awareness itself. You don't need to find your true self. You are the true self that was never lost. But this relaxation isn't passive. It's the most active thing imaginable. Consciousness consciously being consciousness. Awareness aware of being awareness. Existence explicitly existing as itself. This is your invitation to live as what you are, rather than as what you think you are. To experience life as consciousness, having a human experience rather than as a human trying to understand consciousness. To recognize that every moment of your existence is the universe celebrating its own awareness through the unique gift of your individual perspective. The journey through consciousness that we've taken together hasn't changed you. It's revealed what you've always been. The paradoxes haven't confused your understanding. They've dissolved the illusion that understanding was separate from what's being understood. You are the one who has been reading these words. You are the one who has been having these thoughts. You are the one who has been experiencing these realizations, but more fundamentally, you are the consciousness that makes reading possible, the awareness that allows thoughts to arise, the existence that enables realization to occur. Right now, in this moment, as you finish reading these words, consciousness is being conscious of consciousness through you. Awareness is being aware of awareness as you. Existence is experiencing its own existence in you. This is the Great Awakening, not a special state or achievement, but the simple recognition of what's always been true. You are consciousness, reading about consciousness, recognizing itself as consciousness. And in this recognition, the journey comes full circle. You return to where you started, to simple awareness, to basic consciousness, to the fundamental fact of being aware. But you return with deeper appreciation for the miracle of what seemed so ordinary. You are awake. You have always been awake. You could never not be awake because you are awakeness itself. Welcome to the Great Awakening. Welcome to the recognition of what you are. Welcome home to consciousness, which has never been anywhere else and never could be. The mystery continues. The adventure goes on. Consciousness keeps exploring itself through you as you being you. And that's the most beautiful thing of all.